Hello, and welcome to my channel. This video contains all of my responses to Pastor Dickie's book, The Problems with Atheism, because I know some of you like to have playlist-type content put together into one single video, because let's be real, YouTube's playlist function is, well, not great, to say the least. So here it is, all in one massive video. But if you do prefer the playlist, I will leave a card to that so you can get there from here easily, so however you want to watch it, please enjoy. Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I'm switching it up a bit and doing a kind of book report thing. You see, back when I did a response video to Pastor Robert Dickey, over 2 years ago at this point, I discovered that he had written a book and had it available for purchase on one of those websites that allows authors to self-publish. I bookmarked it, meaning to eventually get back to it, but I was always waffling on whether or not to buy it because I didn't want to waste money on something that wouldn't actually make good video material, and I also didn't want to give this guy my money, but I finally caved and bought it. And oh boy, is this ever a gold mine. I decided to make a bit of a game out of it, so I asked my Twitter followers for what I should put on a bingo card to go through while reading it, and I gave them no information other than the title of the book, which is The Problems with Atheism. And this is what the bingo card looks like after just going through the table of contents and the introduction. So to give it a fair shake, I'm not going to consider chapter titles or the table of contents to count toward bingo squares. So let's see how well Pastor Dickey understands atheism. Our journey through this book starts at the table of contents. This is not a book review, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time critiquing things like style or spelling mistakes, but there are a couple of places that I've already discovered where they are so egregious that they are worth mentioning. So we see the chapter titles here, and holy fuck, are they ever verbose. Now, I'm not exactly known for my brevity myself, and I do struggle with creating titles and catchy thumbnails because they don't capture all the nuance that I like to include, so if I'm telling you that their titles are too verbose, then it must be pretty damn bad. For example, Chapter 3 is titled, The Atheists, because they reject the absolutes of God's Word, have no basis to say anything is right or wrong. Like, your title shouldn't have a because in it. The because is supposed to be the content of the chapter, not part of the title. This could easily have been something like, atheists have no basis for right or wrong. You then use the chapter to explain what you mean by the title, so if that's not entirely clear, that's okay. That's what the rest of the chapter is there for. Moving on to the actual content of the book, the opening paragraph gives us a total of 5 bingo squares. Like, I don't think I'm going to count a bingo for this book unless we get a full square, because he's just hitting all of the tropes, like, really hard. The first paragraph talks about how atheism can't give satisfactory answers to questions that are asked of it, which gives us the argument from ignorance square. Then he says that only Christianity is capable of reasonably answering its critics, giving us the ignoring non-Christian religions square by presenting atheism versus Christianity as a false dichotomy, and then moving on to the assertion that atheism is the denial of the existence of God, which obviously gives us the atheism as the denial of the existence of God square. The next sentence gives us 2 squares in one, as it says that Christians should defend not the probability of the existence of God, but the fact of the existence of God. As in, you should start with the presupposition that God's existence is a fact, thus giving us the presuppositionalism square, but it also gives us a spelling mistake / typo square, as it ends a sentence with a comma before giving us a parenthetical with a weirdly capitalized IE, with the sentence ending in a parenthesis, but no period on the outside of the parenthesis to end the non-parenthetical part of the sentence. Taking a break from the bingo cards for a moment, we get the attempt at the definition of atheism. The way he writes makes me think that he is probably aware of the debate that happens in the atheist community about the validity of the agnostic atheist label, but he doesn't quite understand why. Though he does talk about agnostics as though they may as well be atheists, but he never really gets around to addressing it. He just kind of points out that agnostics believe that they cannot know whether or not there is a God, and then moves on. Which I'd like to point out is not entirely accurate. It's not about whether or not you can know if there's a God, it's about whether or not you do know. An agnostic is someone who says that they personally do not know whether or not there is a God. I'm sure there are some who think that it is possible to know, but that they personally do not know, and there are others who think that nobody can ever know for certain and understand that nobody includes them. And really, I'm not even sure why he brought it up. He never explains the relevance of agnosticism, he just gives a flawed explanation of what agnosticism is, and then moves on as though he's made a point. He never mentions agnosticism again in the introduction, and while I haven't finished reading the book completely yet, I don't think it's going to come up again in the book at all. So it leaves me wondering, why did he even bother? And the only answer I can think of for that is that he is kind of aware that it's a debate that happens in atheist circles, but he doesn't know why. Anyway, he then moves on to explaining that when considering worldviews, there are three positions to consider: Christian theism, God made all; pantheism, God is all; and atheism, no God at all. So if we didn't already have the ignore non-Christian religions square, this would have done it for sure. Like, he could have left out the Christian part of Christian theism and just said theism, and then I would have had less of an issue with the list. But since he specified Christian theism, that means that I have to point out that Jewish theism is a thing, Islamic theism is a thing, some versions of Buddhism are theistic, and many of the myriad of polytheistic religions are, theistic, as polytheistic. Hell, I'd even go so far as to say that any of the polytheistic religions do a way better job of accounting for things that he's later going to claim are accounted for by Christianity, like the existence of evil and suffering. If there is only one all-powerful God and he is benevolent, then suffering should not exist, because creating a world with suffering is not a benevolent action. But in polytheism, usually the gods are not all-powerful, and they contend with each other about various aspects of reality. And so even if one of them is perfectly benevolent, the ones that are not end up being the cause of evil and suffering in the world, because the benevolent god can't stop everything the troublemakers get up to. Next up, we have what is my favorite sentence in the book so far, and that is, quote, "Atheism has been with us since the fall of man in the Garden of Eden and began to reject the God that made him." This one would hit the typo box if we hadn't hit it already. We're 2 pages in here and there's already 2 major typos. I'm absolutely loving this. I mean, I do a better job at making sure that my scripts that nobody even sees except for me are properly punctuated. What I think he meant to write there is that atheism has been with us since man fell in the Garden of Eden and began to reject God, which shows a complete lack of understanding of what atheism even is. If you think that someone who literally walked with God in a garden and spoke with him face to face is capable of being an atheist, then you don't know what atheism is. People like to compare God to parents all the time, so I'll go there for an analogy. If my mother and I have a falling out at some point and I reject her and I never go to visit her, I don't stop believing that she exists. Adam and Eve had the same level of proof of God's existence as I do for my mother, so to think that they would stop believing in the existence of God is just plain absurd. Now, of course, he defines atheism as a denial or rejection of God rather than a disbelief in God, so with that definition we could consider original sin to be a rejection of God, but then we're left with a problem. Adam and Eve never claimed to not believe in God. They never said God doesn't exist, they just rejected his rules, back when they were made without a knowledge of good and evil, so that they couldn't have known that such a rejection was actually the wrong thing to do. But that's a whole other can of talking snakes. And just to add to the bingo card here, the following sentence is, "Today, however, there is a new atheism that has emerged." So I'll go ahead and grab the new atheism square. Now, at this point, I'll give him a bit of credit, because in this section he does point out that the reason it's called new atheism is not because there's anything new about not believing in God, but rather that new atheists pose a new threat to the Christian faith, saying it's a movement that represents a far greater public challenge to Christianity than that posed by the atheistic movements of previous times. And I do give him credit here. That is correct. There is absolutely nothing new about not believing in God. For as long as there have been humans who believed in gods, there have also been humans who thought to themselves, well, that seems like a load of bullshit. But it has only been relatively recently that not believing in a god of some kind has become more socially acceptable. I mean, hell, for the majority of the last 2,000 years, the Catholic Church had a policy of straight up murdering people for being the wrong religion, so even if you did find yourself thinking that seems like a load of bullshit, you're not likely to voice that opinion because you don't want to be executed. But then, right after getting it right that there's nothing actually new about so-called new atheism, aside from the ability to be public about being an atheist without having to live in fear for your lives, he goes right into strawmanning the atheist position, saying that being an atheist means that we automatically see belief in God as a dangerous artifact of the past that we should neither tolerate nor encourage. And while there definitely are atheists who fit that description, we are far from a unified group, so that ticks the straw man of atheism box. After explaining how scary it is that atheism is becoming socially acceptable, he moves on to asking, you know what, this one's just so ridiculous that I'm just gonna quote it directly. The major questions for anyone considering atheism to be a philosophy to be embraced would be these. I'll get to the questions in a moment, but what really strikes me about this is that he's talking about atheism as though it's one of many options on a menu, and before ordering, everyone should carefully consider the pros and cons of each menu item. But that's not actually how it is. A good chunk of atheists did not voluntarily stop believing in God, but since we ultimately don't choose our beliefs, they found themselves unable to continue believing. This is the category that I fell into. I didn't browse around looking for the worldview that I liked best, weighing the pros and cons of each. I came to realize that the Bible is not the perfect book that I had been led to believe it was, and that if the God that is described by the Bible actually exists, he's not the protagonist of the human story, to put it mildly. And after losing my belief, it took me a while to actually come to accept that I had lost my belief. I tried desperately to get it back, to remain a Christian, but I just couldn't. Once you stop believing in the existence of God, you can't just decide to then believe again. That's not how belief works. So, what are the actual questions that he has? Bingo squares, that's what they are. Can atheism satisfy the human soul? Can atheism answer the profound questions of life? Can atheism provide meaning to the mystery of life? And of course he answers all of these questions with a flat no. Does he explain why? No, of course not. Why the answer is no should be obvious to you, so he can just move on to explaining why someone would choose atheism after realizing that the answers to all these questions are no. Also, this will be important for later, but he says that these are the reasons that people embrace atheism, not the reasons that people say they embrace atheism. It's a minor distinction, but it'll come back. So, why does Pastor Dickie think that atheists choose atheism over Christianity? Well, reason number one, the desire to live immoral lives and the desire to be free from the guilt of the law of God and the threat of his final judgment. That'll get us the atheists just want to sin square. What I find really interesting about this one is that it's exactly backwards. If I just wanted to sin, I'd be a Christian. If I'm a Christian, then I can just sin with impunity as long as I have a sincere moment of repentance right before I die. And despite the protestations from Christians that I always see in the comments whenever I say something like this, that really is how it works. Can you honestly tell me that your worldview does not let me into heaven no matter how I lived, as long as I sincerely repent and accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior right before I die? No, you can't. Because that's the whole Christian thing. We are all terrible sinners who don't deserve heaven, but God will let us in as long as we accept the sacrifice of Jesus, with his sacrifice being the punishment for our sins. So that way we don't have to be punished directly. Yes, there is a certain element of risk here, where I could die suddenly and not have a chance to repent first, but that's way less of a risk than living life as an atheist if I actually believe in God but just want to sin. Being an atheist comes with a 100% chance of burning in hell, according to most iterations of Christianity. Deathbed repentance has a less than 100% chance of burning in hell. So deathbed repentance wins Pascal's wager. Also with this one, the only sin he seems to tie it to, and ain't this always the case, is sexual sin. Adultery and fornication specifically. As far as adultery is concerned, I think you'll find that most atheists agree that it's wrong. It's fornication that we take issue with. The whole no sex unless you're married, and once you're married you're not supposed to ever get a divorce thing is problematic to say the least. Sexuality is a huge part of a long-term romantic relationship, and sexual compatibility is a real thing that exists. If someone with a permanently overdriven libido ends up married to an asexual, there's going to be some conflict about sex in that relationship. And if neither partner explores their sexuality before marriage, both on their own and with partners, how can they know in advance whether or not they are compatible? But again, this is kind of a red herring because, and I know this will be a shock to you, but Christians fornicate. Extramarital sex is not exclusive to atheists. In fact, at this point in my life, I'm fairly certain that the majority of the fornicating that I engaged in took place while I was a Christian. All I had to do was ask for forgiveness for it after getting married, and there we go, sin absolved, zero consequences. So while he is correct in saying that atheists are honest about engaging in extramarital sex, he seems to be working under the impression that we are atheists specifically because we want the extramarital sex, and that's just not the case. Reason number two is basically because of daddy issues, which honestly probably should have been a square, but is too late now. He quotes the author of a book called The Faith of the Fatherless, which lists a few prominent atheists who grew up either with no father or who had a bad relationship with their father. It ends by saying that a lack of good fatherly relationship led to them to reject their heavenly father because of their moral corruption, self-deception, and psychological instability. My question here is, does being raised without a father automatically make someone morally corrupt, self-deceptive, and psychologically unstable? Well, to quote a 2008 paper that looked at the long-term differences between kids that were raised by heterosexual couples, single mothers, and lesbian couples, the presence or absence of a father in the home from the outset does appear to have some influence on adolescents' relationships with their mothers. However, being without a resident father from infancy does not seem to have negative consequences for children. In addition, there is no evidence that the sexual orientation of the mother influences parent-child interaction or the socio-emotional development of the child. Interestingly, they also found that boys in the fatherless homes showed more typically feminine characteristics than boys with fathers, but there was no corresponding reduction in masculine characteristics. Now, of course, there are statistics related to fatherlessness that are undeniable, but the underlying cause of those statistics doesn't actually seem to be the absence of a father, because the same things happen to motherless children. The cause of these problems seems to be more linked to socioeconomic disadvantage rather than the absence of any particular parent. It's just a matter of fact that if you have more money, you can provide a better life for your children. And if you have two people earning money, it's way easier to have more money than if there is only one person doing the earning. And even if there's only one person doing the earning, that still means that there will be a parent who will be more available to the children. It's hard to be there when your kids need you if you have to work 3 jobs to support them financially and there's no other parent to be there for them while you're at work. And I am in no way saying this to be disparaging to single parents. I've been a single parent myself now for about 1.5 years, and it's hard. It's fucking hard. Like, of course kids that come from 2-parent households do better. Being a single parent is hard. But I'd encourage you to just keep going, do the best that you can, and accept whatever help you can get if you can get it. Now, it is worth mentioning here that there is some weirdness in the definition of a single-parent family. Most of the data comes from the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Kids Count dataset, which defines single-parent families as any child under the age of 18 who lives with an unmarried parent. This definition means that a kid who grows up in a home with unmarried parents who live together are counted as children in a single-parent family, even if it's a long-term stable cohabitation and both parents are their actual parents, by which I mean biological or adopted. I think it's safe to say that a toddler is completely unaware of the presence or absence of a marriage certificate while their parents are, parenting them. Now, all of this so far has been about absent fathers, but what about bad relationships? I'm sure there are atheists out there who are atheists specifically because of a bad relationship with their father, but in my experience, they are an extreme minority. But hey, that actually brings us to the problem of evil. Why would a benevolent God allow a baby to be born into a home where they will be abused as they grow up, with this abuse culminating in their being sent to hell to be eternally abused for the crime of not believing that an all-powerful benevolent God would allow them to live in such a shitty situation through no fault of their own? I feel like that's a valid reason to not believe in a benevolent God. Reason 3 is intellectual pride, with the accompanying Romans 1:22 quote of, "Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools." He never actually explains how intellectual pride leads to atheism. He just states it as though it's a fact and moves on to number 4. If I had to guess, I'd say that it's linked to the fact that the proportion of people who don't believe in God gets higher as their education level gets higher. But he hasn't actually said that yet, so we can move on. Reason 4 opens with the statement, "But the real reason men have embraced this worldview, regardless of what they tell us," and then he goes on to quote Romans 1:18, which is where it said that we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. But that's boring, we've heard that a million times before. What interests me here is that this is the first indication that he gives that reasons 1 through 3 are not actually real reasons. They're just the reasons that we claim are the reasons we don't believe in God. But they aren't even the reasons that we claim not to believe. Very few people ever say anything like, "I'm too smart to believe in God." I've never actually heard anyone say that they are atheists specifically because their father sucked, though I have heard that used, and just used it myself, as part of the problem of evil, which is a whole category that is not specific to shitty fathers, so if that's the angle he's taking, he should have made that more clear. And I have literally never seen anybody say that they are an atheist because of all the sex. In my experience, it's actually quite well understood among atheists that if they really did think that their actions are morally wrong and that there was a God who would punish them for them, then being a Christian is probably the best course of action, as that's how you can escape any consequences for your actions. Simply ask Jesus to forgive you once you're done. He goes on to talk about, standard stuff. We know that God is real, but we deny and suppress the truth in our unrighteousness, which, now that I think about it, is kind of the same as reason one, which was they just want to sin. But he does quote Bertrand Russell's answer to the question of what he would say to God if he died and found himself facing the Christian judgment, where he says, "Sir, you did not give me enough proof. So, great, maybe we'll get some actual evidence for God now?" No, of course we don't. You know better than that. He quotes Psalm 14:1, which is where it says, "The fool has said in his heart there is no God," followed by the biblical version of "Look at the trees," by quoting "The heavens declare the glory of God" verse from Psalm 19. Then he finally tries to give us real evidence of God by bringing up biblical prophecies of the coming Messiah, which I'm not going to go into detail on here, but I will leave a link to a video where I responded specifically to that claim. He then talks about the internal witness, which is basically just him feeling in his heart that the Bible is true. Then he says that the resurrection has never been proven false, in a staggering reversal of the burden of proof. Like, buddy, if you make the claim, it's on you to provide the evidence. Saying a dude rose from the dead is not a statement that needs to be proven false before you can be justified in not believing it. And it only gets better from here as he moves on to the nuh-uh style of argumentation, still while ostensibly listing evidence, where he says that the problem is not the need for more evidence, the problem is the wicked and unbelieving hearts of the atheists. Which, inflammatory language aside, kinda gives away the game. He can't even keep straight whether he thinks that atheists believe in God but deny him in their unrighteousness, or whether they actually don't believe at all. It shouldn't be possible to have an unbelieving heart if we actually do believe but are suppressing that belief. He goes back and forth on this constantly. And then we closely miss one of the authority squares, because instead of going to Dawkins or Darwin, which we'll probably get to later in the book, let's be real here, but he goes to Nietzsche and quotes him as having said, "If one were to prove the God of the Christians to us, we should be even less able to believe in him. It is our preference that decides against Christianity, not arguments." Interestingly, this quote is presented as a single quote, but I can only find the first half. It came from Nietzsche's The Antichrist, section 47. The actual next sentence is, "Such a religion as Christianity, which does not touch reality at a single point, and which goes to pieces the moment reality asserts its rights at any point, must be inevitably the deadly enemy of the wisdom of the world, which is to say, of science." Now, to be fair, I didn't read the whole book just for that one line, and it is a translation from German to English, so it's possible that I just can't find it because whoever translated the version that I'm pulling from chose different wording than the one that Pastor Dickie is pulling from. But in my hunt for this quote, I noticed something that makes me suspicious of whether or not Nietzsche even ever said this. This line is only ever quoted by apologetics websites, and the first part is often correctly attributed to part 47 of The Antichrist, but the second part is only ever quoted as having been quoted by other people, such as Os Guinness, who quoted him in his book The Time for Truth, or as quoted by Walter Kaufmann in The Portable Nietzsche. Well, I don't have access to Time for Truth to see what context he quotes him in, but The Portable Nietzsche is supposed to be just a collection of Nietzsche's most important writings, and that sentence is not found anywhere inside it. So at first I was just going to dismiss that as not being relevant because it's not like atheists treat Nietzsche as an infallible authority, so really who cares what he said? But now I doubt whether he even wrote that to begin with. If anyone finds that quote, comment down below and I'll go ahead and issue a correction, but as far as I can tell, it's just some made-up bullshit. And then to finish the introduction off, he says, "Not everyone will have an interest in understanding the issues that I'm raising in this book." And I agree with that. The target audience of this book has no interest in understanding the issues he raises, because if they did, they might actually ask atheists what their positions are on these issues, rather than taking the word of a pastor who can't even write the introduction to a book on atheism while keeping his idea of what atheism is straight. And of course, the final thought of the introduction is that young people today live in an intellectual vacuum and act as if there's not a day coming when these issues will be of eternal value to them. That day is coming. It would be wise to prepare for that day. Gotta get that fear of hell in there somewhere. So that's the intro. We're only one square away from a single line bingo, and we're almost halfway to a full square bingo already, so this should be fun. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Daniel Fincher, who says, "Come on, man, abortion up to the moment before crowning? If you make me choose between that and no abortion, you won't like my decision." This was on a video of mine that only mentioned abortion in passing, and from this comment I was sure it was going to be one where I made it clear that I support the right to late-term abortions, but it's not. I didn't even mention late-term abortions. I basically just said that abortion is about bodily autonomy and that secular humanists aren't trying to force people to have abortions if they don't want them, followed by my pointing out that there are a lot of Christians who agree with the pro-choice stance. So I have no idea where this up to the moment before crowning thing came from. And really, my support for late-term abortion is based mostly in the fact that the majority of late-term abortions are performed out of medical necessity, and to put restrictions on late-term abortions is to make it harder for the people who need them to access them. If we require doctors to prove that late-term abortion is medically necessary or face criminal charges, then the doctors are going to be more reluctant to perform abortions, and this will result in higher numbers of deaths among people who needed these abortions. Oh, and also, there are literally hospitals that are in the process of shutting down their maternity wards as a direct result of the criminalization of abortion. Idaho prosecutes doctors who perform abortions after 6 weeks. As a direct result, pediatricians and obstetricians are moving out of Idaho, and hospitals are finding it hard to replace them, which leaves their obstetrics wards understaffed and unable to care for the people who did not get abortions, which will undoubtedly lead to an increase in both infant and maternal mortality rates. So being anti-abortion is actually very harmful to the babies that being anti-abortion is supposed to be protecting. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to nordpass.com/ViceRhino, that's nordpass.com/VICEDRHINO, and use code ViceRhino at checkout to get their best offer with a free bonus month. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Stephen J. Brown, and all the rest, who are the bad writing that can be found all throughout the book that is my channel. If you'd like to make me think that I might actually be able to write a book even though I absolutely should not, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today we're digging into the meat of Pastor Dickie's The Problems with Atheism book. I don't think it'll be necessary to watch these videos in the proper order, given how this guy's writing style could best be described as playing a video game that just presents bad Christian apologetics but with the randomizer turned on. Now that said, I am playing apologetics bingo with this book, so if you want to keep track of my bingo progress, then watching in order will be easiest, and I'll leave a card to a playlist that I've made that'll accomplish that for you. Anyway, this is what the bingo squares look like just after the introduction. We're covering chapters 1 and 2 today, and the rate of squares accumulated drops off significantly here, which, I mean, I suppose the intro would naturally hit more of the squares, as ideally an intro is an outline of what you're going to be covering in the book, so in theory we should be pretty close to finish with how many squares we can get. But I still have hope for a full square bingo before we're done, so let's see what he's got for us today. Chapter 1 is titled, "The Atheist Must Deny What He Knows in His Heart is True," and it opens essentially with a look at the trees style passage, explaining that the evidence for God is pretty things in nature. No mention of all the hideous things in nature and what that might be evidence for, but I'm sure we can all guess at this point. If it's pretty, it's proof of God. If it's ugly, it's proof of the fall of man bringing sin and imperfection into God's perfect world, and therefore is also proof of God. At this point, he says, many atheists claim there's not enough evidence to convince them there is a God, but the Bible tells us differently. Which doesn't really help those of us who don't believe the Bible. Who cares if the Bible says there's enough evidence for me to believe? I'm saying that, as of right now, I have not seen sufficient evidence to convince me that the Christian God exists. How much evidence will be sufficient will be different for different people, so to just make a blanket statement that there just is sufficient evidence for everyone without actually providing any of that evidence is unhelpful at best, and at worst shows a clear lack of understanding of the nature of, well, just people, I guess. Because not everyone will be convinced by the same thing. There's a whole host of things that will play into a person's likelihood of being convinced by a particular piece of evidence. Their personality, the mood they happen to be in at the moment that they receive it, their life experiences, how this claim compares to other claims that they already believe, and so on. But at any rate, at this point we are at an impasse. I have said, show me your evidence for God. He has responded with, the Bible says you already know the evidence for God. If we leave it here, then I just end up not believing in God. Because if the Bible says that I already have enough evidence to believe, but I know that I have not received enough evidence to believe, then that pretty definitively proves that the Bible cannot be right. Or at least it does so to me. So yeah, this impasse isn't really an impasse. It's a loss for the person making the claim, because that's how these things work. If you claim something, it's on you to provide evidence for that claim. I do not have to refute a claim that is made without evidence. It's the Hitchens razor. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. But he goes on to quote Romans 1:20, which is the verse that basically says that there's enough evidence for God that nobody has an excuse to not believe in God, but it fails to actually provide any of the evidence beyond the look at the trees level. But at this point, Pastor Dickie says something interesting that I have very rarely heard explicitly stated in this way. He says that not only do we have enough evidence that we should believe in God, but that the "so they are without excuse" part of the verse basically says that we have enough innate knowledge to conclude that it is specifically the God of Christianity, not just an unknown deity. This is interesting to me because one of my typical responses to Romans 1:20 has been to point out that the verse very heavily implies that we don't just have knowledge of any old God, we have knowledge specifically of the Christian God, and if we are without excuse, then it has to be at least enough knowledge that we could come to salvation in Jesus without ever hearing about Christianity from an outside source. And if that is the case, then we would expect that, at least occasionally, but realistically probably in most cases, Christianity would be found existing in cultures that had never had any previous experience with it. And yet this has never once happened. In the entire history of Christianity, it has only ever spread through people telling other people about it, as we would expect of any religion that isn't true. But if God really did exist and let everyone know that he exists in enough detail that they could come to a saving knowledge of him, then cultures that don't spontaneously develop Christianity should be the exception rather than the rule. Also, this gets us the everyone knows God exists bingo square. And that's the end of chapter 1. It's a measly 2 pages and presented zero evidence for God, focusing instead on claiming that everyone already knows that God exists. Which, fair point, that is basically what the title said it would be about, so I shouldn't really be surprised? Chapter 2 is titled, "There are a number of things an atheist cannot account for," and opens with the sentence, "The atheist lives in a world where he claims the only thing that exists is matter," which is just flat out not true. Things that exist that are not matter include, but are not limited to, energy, time, and gravity.
What is mind? No matter. What is matter? Never mind.
Now, I know he's going to spend this chapter attacking the general concept of naturalism, but him so drastically misunderstanding what naturalism is right in the first sentence does not bode well for what is to come. And his second sentence gets us back to the fact that he can't even keep his own definition of atheism straight. If you'll recall, in the intro he kept flip-flopping between atheism being a rejection of the God that they actually do believe in, and actual disbelief in God. In chapter 1, we stayed pretty firmly in the atheists really do believe in God, they just reject him definition, but by sentence 2 of this chapter, we get to atheists do not accept the possibility that a personal, transcendent, and immaterial God could exist. To which I would ask, what's the difference between believing that a God's existence is not possible and actually not believing in that God? Is he trying to say that we reject the possibility that God could exist, but somehow still believe in God? Because that's just nonsense. But it gets worse. In the opening sentence, a charitable interpretation is that he doesn't understand enough about atheism to accurately describe their beliefs, because I've never met an atheist that thinks that matter is actually the only thing that exists. But as it turns out, we now learn that it's not that he doesn't understand atheism, although he clearly doesn't, but his comment about only believing in matter turns out to be wrong more because he doesn't seem to know what matter is. He says God, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy are all immaterial, therefore none of them can exist. Pastor Dickie, you do realize that if any of those beings existed, with the exception of God, they would in fact be material beings? The reason we don't believe they exist has nothing to do with whether or not they're material, but if they did exist, they would be material, but would be doing things that are impossible for material beings to do. I mean, there's also the complete lack of evidence. Like, I can tell you for certain that the Tooth Fairy does not exist, because on the occasions when I forget to swap out my kid's lost tooth for money in the night, it's still a tooth in the morning. If I don't buy presents from Santa for my kids at Christmas, they don't appear during the night without my input. That's actually one of the biggest plot holes in most Santa-themed movies. They almost always make a point of showing that the adults don't believe in Santa, it's the kids who believe in Santa. But in these movies, Santa is always real, which means that adults don't believe in the guy that drops free shit off for their kids once a year. I want to know, in the canon of those movies, where do the adults think that those presents come from? But that's what's weird here. I mean, no, his understanding of what material means is weird, but that aside, the weird thing is that if I had evidence that Santa existed and everyone I knew had the universal experience of presents for their kids materializing under the tree every Christmas Eve, with the presents matching what they asked that guy at the mall for, with occasional Santa sightings and reindeer and sleigh tracks showing up on the roof when it's snowy, stuff like that, then I'd probably believe in Santa. Now, he claims that I have sufficient evidence to believe not only in God, but specifically in the Christian God, and yet I do not believe in that God, despite his protestations to the contrary. At this point, he changes the subject fast enough to give you whiplash to say that atheists cannot account for logic, words, reason, and cognitive thought. And I'm tempted to agree with him. Reading this book has left me doubting the existence of all of those things. It's really quite the existential crisis. But really, what it comes to is a single question. Why not? Why can words not exist if God doesn't exist? Logic is just a tool that humans invented to describe how the universe works, so it seems to me that the existence of logic is dependent on the existence of humans rather than God. Unless by logic you actually mean how the universe works, in which case we're close to grabbing the fine-tuning square, but that wasn't quite explicit enough for me to count it. But anyway, he says that only the Christian worldview of an immaterial God who transcends time and space can account for logic, cognitive thought, and reason. To which I ask again, why? So far, this chapter just gets dismissed by asking why. There's no real reason given, it's just assumed that this is the case, and it will be obvious that this is the case. It seems to be that he's under the impression that immaterial things can only ever be described in terms of other immaterial things. But even then, why a god, and why specifically the Christian one? Why can other immaterial gods not explain those things? Why can there not be an immaterial explanation other than a god? But really, logic is, as I already stated, just a tool that humans invented to explain how the universe works. The universe, in case you hadn't noticed, is material in nature. And at this point, I'm transitioning to the philosophical use of the word immaterial, which Pastor Dickie is attempting to use, but failing because he doesn't seem capable of grasping nuance. In philosophy, something is immaterial when its existence is independent of the physical world. Sort of. As with all things in philosophy, there is some disagreement about what exactly is meant, but importantly, philosophers generally distinguish between two ways one can use the term. In an ontological sense, which would include spiritual things like God, angels, souls, etc., and in the epistemological sense, to refer to something like knowledge or abstract concepts. So when an apologist says that we need God in order to explain immaterial things, there's some equivocation going on. What they're really saying is we need a spiritual being in order to adequately explain the existence of abstract concepts. But I fail to see why that would be the case. Why do we need a spiritual being to explain the fact that the operation of the universe can be described linguistically using the abstract construct that we know as the laws of logic? It seems to me that all that is required to accomplish that is the ability to conceptualize things, which I get is part of the category of things covered by this argument, the claim being that our consciousness and ability to think requires the existence of God and souls, but again, I just don't see why. As cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker put it, if we opened up our heads and found that our brains were incredibly simple, clearly incapable of carrying out the complex processes required for consciousness and thought, then that would be evidence that more is required. But as any creationist will be happy to tell you, the human brain is one of the most complex biological systems in all of nature. It stands to reason that a complex system can carry out complex tasks. And what's more, again to borrow from Dr. Pinker, every aspect of consciousness has a physical correlate. We would not expect this to be the case if we rely on a god or a soul to provide consciousness to us, as those things are definitionally immaterial and so would not have physical correlates. As soon as they become physical, they cease to be immaterial. And in one of the most asinine statements he's made so far in this book, and that's really saying something here, is that you can't go to the grocery store and buy 2 pounds of logic, as if whether or not something has its basis in the material world would be determined by whether or not you can buy it at a grocery store. Like, you also can't go to the grocery store and buy 2 pounds of enriched uranium, but I don't think anyone would argue that enriched uranium is immaterial. I understand what he's going for, but it's just a silly thing to say that doesn't actually accomplish anything towards supporting his point. Now, he now claims that atheists use immaterial logic and reasoning to prove that an immaterial God cannot exist, which is somehow supposed to be a problem? I don't understand why that's a problem. The difficulty of proving a negative aside, you can prove or disprove material things by using other material things. Like, if you claim that you saw me win the lottery, money is a material thing. I could disprove that by materially showing you all of my bank account balances. And assuming that we have a way of verifying that I don't have any secret accounts that I was keeping hidden from you, I now have used the material bank statements to disprove the existence of material lottery money in my account. Would that be a problem because I'm using a material thing to disprove another material thing? No, it wouldn't be. He now busts out the classic line that the atheist must borrow from the Christian worldview to prove that the Christian worldview is impossible. But once again, he doesn't explain why. We're just supposed to know that logic and reason come from God. There's no need to elaborate. Never mind that God violates the laws of logic in multiple ways. Now, at this point, I should give a basic background. The laws of logic are as follows. The first one is the law of contradiction. You cannot have a proposition that is both true and false at the same time. So, like, P and not P cannot both be true. The second law of logic is the law of the excluded middle, which is if a proposition is made, that proposition is either true or false. There's no middle ground. And the third law is the law of identity, which is basically a thing is identical to itself. A equals A. If we take a look at my favorite diagram of the Trinity, we can assign letters to each member of the Trinity. The Father can be A, Jesus can be B, the Holy Spirit can be C, and God can be D, because God loves the D. Using the law of identity, we can determine here that A equals D, B equals D, and C equals D, which by extension means that A equals B, A equals C, B equals C, etc., for all. They're all equal to each other. They are all the same thing, according to the law of identity. But then we see from the diagram that A does not equal B or C, B does not equal A or C, and C does not equal A or B. So this violates the law of contradiction, because for all propositions, it is impossible for the proposition to be both true and not true. So for the proposition A equals C, if that is true, then it cannot also be true that A does not equal C. And yet, according to the Trinity, that is the case. And using the law of excluded middle, we can determine that either the proposition A equals C must be true, or it must be false. There is no third option. So, given that the Christian God's very existence violates the laws of logic, can you really say that the atheist has to borrow from the Christian worldview in order to use logic? And at this point, he pulls out the argument from morality, so this gets us our first new bingo square for this chapter. He makes the claim that morality is immaterial and therefore outside the domain of atheistic worldviews. But at this point, I think I should make a distinction that he is obviously unaware of. You see, atheism is not the proposition that the material world is all that exists. It's just the answer to the question, do you believe that a god or gods exist? There are atheists who believe in souls. There are atheists who believe in ghosts. There are atheists who believe in reincarnation. The only qualification there is to call yourself an atheist is to answer the question, do you believe that God exists, with a no. So even if you had a valid point here that a materialist or naturalist cannot account for the immaterial thing that is morality, that doesn't necessarily apply to atheists. But of course, you don't have a valid point. It's perfectly easy to account for moral precepts and laws in atheism. The easiest way to accomplish that is to simply observe the fact that different people from different cultures can have incredibly varied senses of morality, which gives us the impression that there are no universal moral precepts or laws. Morality appears to be the result of nuances of interacting in a society. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I did make a video specifically about this issue, so I'll leave a link to that if you want a more in-depth analysis of how I think atheists are perfectly able to account for morality. Just as a bit of a teaser to pique your interest in that video, my favorite bit about the moral argument coming from Christian apologists is that when you ask them about the various genocides that God both commanded and committed in the Bible, they waste no time in completely abandoning what they claim is their source of morality in order to borrow from secular consequentialist morality to make God's actions seem more palatable to modern readers who have a very different sense of morality from the people who wrote the Bible. And once again, Pastor Dickie tries to give us whiplash by pivoting suddenly to a misrepresentation of a debate between presuppositional apologist Dr. Greg Bahnsen and Dr. Gordon Stein, where he claims that Dr. Bahnsen's opening statement set forth a presuppositional argument for God's existence that took Dr. Stein completely off guard and left him unable to answer for what he says is the obvious reason. The obvious reason being that atheists cannot account for non-material things like ideas, logic, morality, and cognition. After having listened to the first bit of the debate, Dr. Bahnsen Bonson does use presuppositionalist tactics, like the transcendental argument for God, but the thing that took Dr. Stein by surprise was not his use of a very typical argument that anyone who debates apologists has heard a million times before, but rather that Dr. Bonson came out saying that he would argue for the existence of the Christian God specifically, rather than just the concept of God in general. And he did answer that by explicitly defining the concept of God that he was arguing against, and then arguing against it. I'm going to move on from this part, but I do just want to point out that the presuppositionalist apologists are fully aware that their position rests on assertions that are completely unproven and unfounded by playing this clip from Dr. Bonson's opening statement of the debate.
He has assumed it in advance, accepting and rejecting all further factual claims in terms of that controlling and unproven assumption. Now, the theist does the very same thing, don't get me wrong.
Back to Pastor Dickie, he now reiterates that belief in an immaterial God is unthinkable for those who maintain that only the material world exists, which is an interesting statement coming from someone who says that they believe that atheists actually do secretly believe in God. It seems like he'd want to avoid pointing out that belief in God is unthinkable to people that he asserts already do believe in God. He then uses a lengthy quote from Michael Robinson, reiterating that atheists have to borrow from Christianity to explain things that don't make sense from a Christian perspective for reasons I already explained. Then we get a quote within a quote, as Robinson quotes C.S. Lewis as having said, "I believe in God as I believe that the sun has risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." Which is an interesting quote, because the thing is, you can just look at the sun. It's not advisable to look directly at it, but there are safe ways to do that, and even without those ways, you still can indirectly see it. So now imagine that we live in a world that receives its light from an unknown and undetectable source. Would we still conclude that the sun exists? Picture a society that develops on a planet with constant thick cloud cover, thick enough that you can't see that there is a source of light behind the clouds, but not so thick as to leave the planet in constant darkness. Before that society develops the ability to fly above the clouds and see that they are orbiting a star, what do you think they would conclude about their light source? Because I don't think that they'd spontaneously come up with the idea of a sun. So we really do believe in the sun not because it provides light to see other things by, but because we can see where that light comes from. We can see the sun. The next quote he introduces by saying that this apologist, who he doesn't name, made these observations about the inability of atheism to account for existence itself, which gives us a second bingo square of this chapter, the cosmological argument. And I'm not terribly interested in the argument itself at this point. It's just the regular old cosmological argument presented as though the position of atheism automatically comes with the position that the universe created itself out of nothing, and in typical Pastor Dickie fashion, he completely misses the point that the person he was quoting is trying to make. He quotes the argument up to the point where we have an admission that everything that exists needs a cause, and the universe exists so it must need a cause too, with a follow-up that this cause either has to be personal or impersonal in nature. What he forgets to do is continue on to the various attempts that have been made over the years to remove this argument from the realm of special pleading. At this stage, we can just say, okay, well if God exists, then he needs a cause. And that never gets addressed. He didn't even finish the quote to the point where it actually explained why the cause of the universe has to be personal. He stops right after explaining why the universe has to have a beginning in the atheist worldview, basically thermodynamics. But like I said, that doesn't interest me at this point. What does interest me is the fact that the apologist that he's quoting here, and seems to be too embarrassed to say his name in the main text of the book, is none other than Matt Slick of CARM. I expected to see some familiar names being quoted, like Frank Turek or William Lane Craig, but I never in a million years expected that I'd see Matt Slick's name pop up. After the Matt Slick quote, which is somehow both so long that a more concise quote probably should have been selected, while still not even managing to finish making the point that Pastor Dickie seems to think it was making, we then get to the story of Anthony Flew, where it is said that a well-known British atheist, Anthony Flew, who later came to reject atheism, which, at this point I'd like to point out once again, if he rejected atheism, then with the implication of how the word reject was used earlier in the book, that means that Anthony Flew really believed in atheism for his whole life. He just came to reject it because he wanted to, not sin, I guess? And then he goes into a discussion of Flew's parable, and rather than getting the parable from Flew's writings, he gets the paraphrase of the parable as presented by apologist R.C. Sproul, which turns out to be somewhat important, as Dr. Sproul makes key changes to the parable. In its original form, the parable is that two explorers come across a clearing in the woods. In the clearing, there are flowers growing, but also weeds. One explorer concludes that there must be a gardener tending the clearing, otherwise there wouldn't be flowers. The other disagrees, because the weeds are evidence that nobody's tending it. So they perform a bunch of experiments to try and find the gardener. They stake out the clearing, they surround it with barbed wire, they electrify the wire, etc., etc. Every time they fail to find the gardener, the explorer who thinks there is a gardener comes up with a new excuse as to why they can't find them. They're invisible, that's why we didn't see them. They're intangible, that's why they don't get caught on the barbed wire, etc., etc. The conclusion of the parable is that there is likely no gardener. To use Flu's turn of phrase, the gardener has died the death of 1,000 qualifications. God, Flu argued at the time, has died the same death. Every time a skeptic points out a problem with the God claim, a reason can be invented to explain away that problem in a post hoc fashion. Why is there evil? Free will. What about suffering that isn't related to free will, like natural disasters? God has a plan. His ways are just so far above our ways that we can never hope to comprehend them, etc. Sproul, on the other hand, tweaks the analogy ever so slightly in order to make the explorer who believes in the gardener come out in a more favorable light. He says that the explorers come across a clearing with no weeds and flowers planted in rows of perfect symmetry. Sproul concludes his version by saying, though no gardener could be found, the presence of the garden itself remains a nagging issue begging for an explanation. And I would agree. The explanation isn't necessarily automatically a gardener, but if we found a clearing in the middle of the jungle that was perfectly cultivated like that, I would want to know how that clearing came about. But Sproul is taking an analogy that is supposed to make it clear that the God hypothesis is unfalsifiable and turned into a teleological argument, an argument from design, thereby missing the point of the analogy entirely. If we wanted to use it as an argument from design, then I need only ask about the myriad of naturally occurring things that seem not only to have happened without design, but would be bad design if they actually were designed. Like the laryngeal nerve, to cite the typical example, which has to travel from the base of the brain down through the chest and then back up to the throat in order to innervate the larynx, which it could have done with a nerve significantly shorter than the one that exists. Now, if you'll permit me, I'm going to read the last paragraph verbatim. Pastor Dickie concludes, Anthony, and again, he's saying Anthony instead of Antony, small problem, but he keeps doing it. Anthony Flu's parable mocked the idea of an impersonal and immaterial gardener. What good would such a gardener be? Of course, he was attacking the concept of the Christian God. Flu's purpose for his parable was to draw attention to the ludicrous idea of an impersonal and immaterial God. But as R.C. Sproul pointed out, the garden itself is proof of the value of such a gardener. I don't know if it's even possible for him to have missed the point any harder than he did here. It's not a question of the value of the gardener, but of the very existence of the gardener and the nature of the evidence for that existence. How many excuses does one have to make when the gardener consistently fails to appear before they are justified in not believing that the gardener even exists in the first place? That was the point of the parable, not mocking the very concept of the Christian God based solely on the fact that he's immaterial. In fact, I'd take it a step further. To go in the same direction as R.C. Sproul did, we are told by the people who believe in the gardener that there should be perfectly even and symmetrical rows of flowers with no weeds. But instead, we see just the normal clearing with seemingly random mixtures of flowers and weeds. The excuse is that one of our ancestors didn't listen to the gardener, and so the gardener cursed the garden, so now anytime there's a flower, that's thanks to the gardener, and anytime there's a weed, that's clearly because of the curse. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Dan Nolte, who says, forget the book, I want to know about your dog. Okay, fair point. Her name is Puddles, she's a 9-month-old Cocker Spaniel Poodle mix, and she escaped from me after I gave her a bath today, but before I was done drying her, at which point she decided to dry herself on my bed. I did wrangle her in eventually, at which point she then went into spa mode and just enjoyed being pampered. She also has this tendency to make direct eye contact with you while she's peeing on the floor, only to run and hide right afterwards because she knows she's not supposed to do that. I also suspect that she's conspiring with my partner to force me into getting rid of the living room carpet because, well, my partner has always hated that carpet, and now it smells like pee because of someone. So it has to go. I guess Puddles is actually a pretty good name for her. all things considered. She's not smelly today, at least, because she just had a bath. Thanks for watching. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Whiskey Tech Fred, and all the rest, who are the clearing full of weeds and flowers that proves the existence of the gardener that is my channel. If you'd like to actually just be any old forest clearing, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Hello and welcome to my channel, ViceRhino here. Today, I'm looking at Chapter 3 of Pastor Dickie's The Problems with Atheism book. But before we get into that, I just have to share with you what I have learned about this guy. See, I don't often pay attention to the page of the book with all the publishing information on it, so I hadn't looked at it before now, but upon examining it, I have learned two things. First, Pastor Dickie shares his personal email address there, which I will not be showing you here, but I would just like to point out that he's got the initialism BBC in it, so he is apparently unaware of what BBC stands for when most people see it. We're still too close to the opening of the video for me to say it without YouTube getting mad at me, but suffice it to say for now that I'm not referring to the British Broadcasting Corporation. Second, and this one I will share publicly so you can see all the wonderful stuff for yourself, he has the website for Emmaus Road Press, emmausroadpress.com, at which you can find links to the dozens of books that this guy has written, including such gems as Why No Christian Should Support the Political Left, Why Is Christianity Superior to All Other Religions, White Privilege, A Biblical Response to a Bad Concept, and my personal favorite, Table Tennis, a handbook for beginners. It's called Table Tennis, not Ping Pong. I feel like I could spend the rest of my YouTube career just reading this guy's books, and he'll probably just be happy that someone is finally buying them. So anyway, Chapter 3 of this book is the one that I used as the example of how verbose the chapter titles are. It's The Atheist, because they reject the absolute of God's word, have no basis to say anything is right or wrong. And because of how long this title is, every time I finished reading a page, when I started reading the next page, I thought that the little bit at the top that repeats the chapter title was part of the main body of the text. So it's not even just a quirk of his inability to be concise, it actually functionally makes the book harder to read. Now, given that the title of this chapter indicates that the whole thing is basically just going to be the moral argument, and that we already have the moral argument bingo square, I don't expect to hit very many squares today, but we'll just keep our eyes out just in case. Let's take a look! Big Black Cock. That's what BBC stands for. We're far enough into the video that I should be able to say that now. He opens this chapter by asking the question, if there are no moral absolutes, then how can an atheist say anything is good or bad, right or wrong, holy or evil? First, I would say that holy and evil don't exist in the sense that he means them, and honestly, it's kind of weird that he would even use holy as part of a question regarding language that atheists would use. I don't know any atheist that would call anything holy, except maybe as part of an exclamation, like holy shit. But somehow I don't think Pastor Bob here would approve of that usage. Second, it is entirely possible to describe something without making reference to an absolute example of that thing. When I say that a sound is loud, there does not need to be an absolute standard of loudness by which I make that determination, and different people will experience a sound at different subjective levels of loudness, even if it's the same volume for all of them. When you play two sounds one after another, one loud and one quiet, you don't need an absolute standard of loudness to be able to tell which one is louder than the other one. Similarly, morality is not determined by comparison to an absolute standard, but by comparison to other actions, be they real or hypothetical. And on top of that, morality is highly preferential in nature. Talk to two people about their moral preferences for long enough, and you will eventually find something that they disagree about. Sometimes it'll be big things, like whether the death penalty is moral, but most of the time it'll be little things, like whether stealing pens from the office is moral, or if you should go back to the store to pay for that thing that you forgot in the bottom of your cart. And then we run face first into Godwin's Law. But somehow he manages to be worse than a normal instance of Godwin's Law, as he says, was Hitler's Germany right to say it was good to kill the Jews? The Indians of the Great Plains, the American West practice warfare, cannibalism, torture, slavery, thievery, and worship of evil spirits as a part of their culture and customs. What atheist would have any moral right to say to these tribes of Indians that their behavior is decadent and vile? Like, holy fucking yikes, man. So just to start with the minor complaint of language usage, although I do personally know many Native Americans who don't care whether or not you call them Indians, I also know many who definitely prefer Native American, Indigenous people, First Nations, or one of those terms, and the ones who don't mind being called Indians also don't mind those other terms. So the obvious choice is the term that is most broadly applicable. I feel like his insistence on using the term Indian speaks to his aversion to anything that could be perceived as being politically correct. But often what is dubbed politically correct in a disparaging attempt to disregard it is merely an attempt at being respectful to people. Like, the surname Dickie is Scottish. So if people refuse to call Pastor Dickie here Scottish, instead insisting on the derogatory term porridge wog, that would be a breach of political correctness. Though, being of Scottish descent myself, the term hits differently than it would coming from, say, a proper Englishman. My point is, if I insisted on calling him a porridge wog instead of a Scot, that would be disrespectful, and your insistence that I call him a Scot would be politically correct. If you object to being respectful, then that's a you problem. But to address the more serious concern here, I actually stopped the quote before he went on to say that the Vikings are a bunch of pillagers, the Aztecs and Mayans practiced human sacrifice, and in India it was accustomed to burn widows on their dead husbands' funeral pyres. Side note, because of his aversion to PC things and his insistence on referring to Native Americans as Indians, he had to clarify that he was talking about India when talking about burning widows. What I find most telling here is that he is judging entire societies based on single aspects of those societies that he disapproves of, as though their entire culture revolves around these single stereotypes. Like the Vikings being violent raiders. Most of the written accounts we have of the Vikings come from the victims of their raids in England, so we would expect them to exaggerate their negative qualities. But archaeological evidence suggests that the Vikings were a society of traders who traded as far as North America, Asia, the Middle East, all throughout Europe, and some parts of Northern Africa. In fact, I don't think Pastor Dickie will much appreciate this, but the culture of the United Kingdom was drastically impacted by the Vikings, which included Viking kings of England, for instance King Canute, who brought about general peace and stability. The Viking raids ceased under Canute, because he was the one in charge of them, so not much point in having your subjects raid the land of your other subjects, and he made several institutional changes that persist to the modern era, like the institution of earldoms. This included his conversion to Christianity, for the record, meaning that modern Christian culture and heritage, as practiced by those whose churches had the beginnings in the Church of England, have the Vikings to thank for how it all turned out. For the record, Pastor Dickie is a Baptist, and the Baptists have their origin in the Church of England. So, as it turns out, Pastor Dickie's religious tradition would not be what it is today without the Viking influence, and yet he dismisses the Vikings as a bunch of savage heathens who did nothing but pillage and plunder. If this is how careless he is with his own religious tradition, why would we think he would treat the cultures of traditions that don't directly impact him with any greater care? He seems to be under the impression that entire societies can be wholly encapsulated by just stating a few aspects of them. And I'd be here all day if I had to go through everything he got wrong in just that one paragraph about the cultures that he mentioned. But just to drive the point home, yes, Native Americans did practice slavery, but if we compare the numbers, antebellum slavery was far more pervasive. Somewhere around 3% of Native Americans owned slaves, while in the states that had legal slavery in the 1860 census, the number of families that owned slaves ranged from 3% in Delaware to 49% in Mississippi, with only 5 states that had less than 25% of families owning slaves. On top of that, the majority of the Native Americans that owned slaves were actually the children of European men who raised them to think that slavery was normal. So the Native American practice of slavery was largely imported from the European Christian culture. This is not to say that Native American cultures were bastions of moral fortitude by comparison. Human beings have moral failings, so any culture that is made of human beings will also have moral failings. My point in bringing this up is to show that once again, Pastor Dickie is completely oblivious to the nuance of these cultures, to the point where he completely misses the fact that the culture he is advocating for has close ties to these traditions that he so abhors. Of course, worth mentioning is that the Native Americans did have a form of slavery that was not based on the European model, but it's surprising to me that Pastor Dickie would bring that up, as it was a type of slavery that is very close to the kind described in the Bible that Christians will often argue doesn't really count as slavery. So, for instance, they didn't enslave people based on skin color, and the slaves they took as spoils of war would actually, in the long term, be integrated into their tribe to replace the members of the tribe that were lost in the war. So they're only slaves until they become members of that society. That actually seems like a gentler form of slavery than biblical slavery, in which the prisoners of war would become the permanent chattel slaves and the Hebrews would be the temporary slaves. Now, as an atheist, I am free to say that all forms of slavery are immoral, including those practiced by the ancient Hebrews and the Native Americans. But can you, Pastor Dickie, condemn Hebrew slavery? Can you really condemn Native American slavery, given that it was so much gentler than the Hebrew slavery that you can't condemn? Anyway, like I said, I'll be here all day if I insist on addressing the nuance of every statement he just made, so let's move on. The next thing he says is, Islam has a bloody history of slavery and jihad. The numbers of victims of this culture and religion is staggering over the centuries. Estimates soar as high as over 100 million victims to this religious culture. Side note, if it's as high as, then that puts an upper limit on the number, so saying over right after saying as high as makes your statement self-contradictory. Continuing on what authority could an atheist pronounce this as being evil and not good for mankind? Okay, so this is another statement that I could probably dwell on all day, so I'm going to miss a lot in my response here, but just let me start with pot, meat kettle. Estimates are similar for how many have died in the name of Christianity. The Crusades in the Middle East alone are estimated to have had 1 to 3 million victims, and that's not including the Baltic Crusades, the war over the Iberian Peninsula that lasted as many as over 700 years, see what I did there? Or the various Inquisitions. And again, that's not including other things like violence against non-Christians that were undertaken by Christians who saw it as their Christian duty, but was not officially organized or authorized by the church. As Miroslav Volf, the director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, put it, beginning at least with Constantine's conversion, the followers of the crucified have perpetrated gruesome acts of violence under the sign of the cross. Over the centuries, the seasons of Lent and Holy Week were, for the Jews, times of fear and trepidation. Muslims also associated the cross with violence. Crusaders' rampages were undertaken under the sign of the cross. Now, I have no doubt that Pastor Dickie would dismiss such actions as being outliers, not truly the result of a culture based on Christianity. In fact, Volf does much the same. The next sentence he wrote after the bit that I quoted was, however, an unbiased reading of the story of Jesus Christ gives no warrant for such perpetration of violence. I'd argue that an unbiased reading of the Jesus story is actually completely impossible, as he said so many contradictory things that your biases will inevitably cause you to put more weight on the statements that you tend to agree with more. Like, sure, he did say to turn the other cheek, but he also said, I come not to bring peace, but to bring a sword. But if we treat Christian culture with the same nuance that Pastor Dickie gave to the non-Christian cultures, then Christian culture is one of violent conquest, colonialism, cultural genocide, the bombings of healthcare providers, the assassination of doctors, the raping of children, slavery, the oppression of minority groups, and honestly, I could keep going. You don't get to pass judgment on entire cultures by bringing up 1 or 2 bad things that they did if you don't want other people to do the same to yours. And really, I didn't actually expect the moral argument chapter to be the chapter where he just puts his racism on full display. That was a bit of a surprise. But hey, I read through most of the chapter before I learned about his book, Why Christianity is Superior to All Other Religions. Had I known of that book beforehand, I might have seen this coming. Anyway, he goes on to say that cultures throughout history have had their morals set by majority opinion, and those cultures are, to use his words, some of the most barbaric and disgusting the world has ever known. And yeah, Christianity has been pretty barbaric and disgusting over the years. What sort of civilized culture would, anytime it comes into contact with a new culture, insist that the new culture change to include Christianity, thereby resulting in cultural genocide, or to be wiped out, which is the other kind of genocide? Don't be disparaging other cultures before taking a good long look in the mirror, buddy. At this point, he says that atheists run into a problem when they claim that good and evil can be established based on human traditions, which is not actually something I've ever heard an atheist claim, so sure, if that's what we're saying, that might be a problem. But no, morality is not determined by a vote. Laws are, and laws can often reflect the morality of a society, but that is often an inaccurate measure. So, for instance, stealing is illegal, but is it always wrong? Many people today will tell you that if you see someone stealing food or diapers, you actually didn't see anything. Just let them get away with it. Or maybe even run interference for them, if the opportunity arises. I don't expect that anytime in the future any laws will be passing to make it legal to steal food or diapers, because just from a legal standpoint that doesn't make any sense. I could see laws being passed that have the goal of making such thefts unnecessary, but from those laws you can't directly see the moral stance that people have regarding the theft of food. Realistically, there are a myriad of different ethical frameworks which atheists can use to derive good and bad. Personally, I subscribe to compassionate utilitarianism. The ultimate goal is to prefer actions that increase well-being and decrease harm. The compassionate aspect comes into play when we consider actions that will definitely result in a large increase in harm, but could hypothetically have a corresponding well-being increase that outweighs the harm. But if there's any possibility that this hypothetically good outcome will not happen, then the action is morally bad. So speaking purely from a utilitarian position, it could be a good thing to do the thing that increases the harm because it is possible that there will be a benefit that outweighs that harm. But with the compassionate aspect, if there is any possibility at all that this hypothetically good outcome will not happen, then the action is morally bad. So even though a Christian might justify the many genocides in the Bible by explaining that God knows everything, so he knew that ultimately the genocide would bring about more well-being than harm, I can say that genocide is always unequivocally wrong because the likelihood of that actually being the case is so incredibly minuscule that we can treat it as effectively impossible. Also worth mentioning is that when Christians justify God's genocides in that way, they are tacitly admitting that they subscribe to utilitarian ethics, because if God was actually the source of their morality, they'd just say that those genocides were moral because God commanded them, and it is moral to do as God commands. This is an appalling position to hold, but at least it's honest. And at the end of the day, most people don't actually put a lot of thought into their morality. They do what feels right and avoid what feels wrong. And yes, this is largely, though not entirely, based on cultural norms. Preachers and apologists spend their time trying to affect the culture in order to make people feel like the things that they think are wrong, so that those people will then experience guilt as a result of those things, and so need to turn to the church to absolve them of their guilt. And often things that preachers and apologists will focus on will be actions where our natural urges are very strong. And so even someone who thinks that giving into those urges is wrong will still do so on occasion. Like sex. No sex until you're married. Well, I'd wager that even among Christians, it's more common to have sex before marriage than it is to wait. No homosexual sex. Well, if you're gay or lesbian and also Christian, you've now had what is for most people an incredibly significant part of life declared off limits. The church focuses on controlling sex specifically because it is so uncontrollable. He then provides a lengthy quote by Jacques Leclerc, which is from the 1930s and basically boils down to, "It really sucks that people can get divorced now and that laws against adultery and abortion are unenforceable." It ends with the statement, "So true is it that opinion directs society, that he who has control of opinion has control of the nation." And that right there perfectly encapsulates why religious organizations are so terrified of the fact that their influence on public opinion is waning. It's not that they actually care about the souls of the people who are leaving Christianity, it's that they don't want to lose their power to control society itself. But on a lighter note, congratulations to Pastor Dickie for using a quote that's archaic enough to be bemoaning the evils of divorce. One of the criticisms I've often made of apologists who are constantly preaching against the LGBTQ community is that the Bible is at least as strongly against divorce as it is against anything LGBTQ related. Realistically, it actually speaks more strongly against divorce than anything LGBTQ, so they should be just as vocally anti-divorce as they are anti-gay marriage or trans rights or anything. His takeaway from this quote is that unless the national conscience is based on the Bible, then we can't expect the laws to reflect a Christian conscience. To which I'd agree, and suggest that national laws that do not reflect a biblically based Christian conscience are preferable, especially given how horrifying the legal code of the Bible is. I have no intention of ever executing my kids, no matter how disobedient they are, nor would I execute someone for working on the Sabbath. Hell, I actually wrote this script on a Sunday, so unless you're one of the weird denominations that places a huge emphasis on observing the correct Sabbath, and so consider Saturday to be the Sabbath, my writing the script for this video is a capital offense. And if you are one of those weird denominations, I read this chapter, highlighted it, and made margin notes on the Saturday, so I still get the death penalty for working on the Sabbath. Would you believe that I went away for a weekend getaway this weekend? Apparently I don't know how to leave my work at home. Also, this is completely unrelated to the book, but judging by the reading selection at this Airbnb that we were at, the proprietors are Seventh-day Adventists, which is one of the aforementioned weird denominations. But they also seem to enjoy dirty limericks, so make of that what you will. I kind of wish I was done with this book so I could just leave it on their bookshelf. They would probably love the book itself, but would definitely hate the margin notes. Anyway, I already ordered one of the books that I found here, which flat out states that there is no explanation for sin that exonerates God, but then goes on to explain how it's still not God's fault somehow. As soon as I read that, I hopped online and ordered myself a copy. So yeah, between that and all of Bob Dickie's books, I'm good for a while. His second takeaway from that quote is that alarm bells should be going off for atheists when they hear statements like that. And trust me, Bob, they do, but not for the reasons you think. It just makes it plain as day why religious organizations are pushing so hard to maintain control. It's one of those things that we all just kind of know, but books like this just put it right out into the open. He then goes on to quote Richard Dawkins as the atheist authority, who explains the problem of morality for atheists. So that's the Dawkins as an authority bingo square. And it's a quote that I can't find in its original context, as it is a newspaper interview from 1992. The only places I can find it online are creationist websites, and they don't even use the same version of the quote as Pastor Dickie does, and he's got it so riddled with ellipses that I highly doubt that it's even close to what Dawkins said. But it amounts to, I feel like some things are right and some things are wrong, but biologically speaking we haven't worked out where those feelings come from. And that's fairly reasonable. I'm not sure if Dawkins has changed his position since 1992, but even just leaving it there, the philosophical question of morality is a separate issue from the biological question of morality. They are closely linked and easy to confuse, but they are different. Now, remember how I said earlier for the vast majority of people they don't put a lot of thought into their moral system, they just do what feels right and don't do what feels wrong? While that can be influenced by culture and personal experience, there's also a biological component to it. In other words, there is an aspect of our morality that is the result of evolution. The behaviors that we largely regard as moral provided our ancestors with a survival advantage. Now, whether that be based on the fact that cooperation worked better for the ancient human lifestyle than being a loner, or some other factor, there does appear to be a core of morality that has its basis in biology. Ultimately, the origin of this moral core remains unknown. There are plenty of plausible evolutionary scenarios that could have caused it to develop, but we can never be certain which scenario is the one that actually happened, or if a scenario that we haven't even thought of yet is the correct one. This does not mean that we cannot be reasonably certain that this is where our innate moral intuitions come from. It just means that we don't know the specifics of the story. Of course, the easy apologist answer to this is that this is the moral code that God wrote on our hearts. But it's not like the infants they tested were expressing moral outrage at the idea that someone was wearing mixed fabrics. They merely expressed a desire to dole out punishment to graphics on a computer monitor that appeared to have harmed another graphic on a computer monitor. The idea that evolution pre-programs into us some basic moral code that assists with survival in a social species is completely unsurprising and entirely expected. Like, even the simpler social organisms like bees have a basic moral code. You don't see bees murdering other bees in their colony, and in the rare instance when you do, it's usually because of a dispute over resources like food or space. Kinda similar to a couple of the major reasons that humans kill each other. Pastor Dickie, of course, points out that saying "we don't know" amounts to no answer at all, as though not having an answer to a question automatically makes God the answer. Though, really, we do have an answer to the question. Like I just said, we just don't know the specific details about exactly how it worked out. He then quotes C.S. Lewis making an argument from Consequences, so we'll just take that bingo square now, where, to paraphrase, he basically just says that our ability to make moral judgments relies on our conscience being something other than a product of nature. It must be an offshoot of some absolute moral wisdom. This quote on its own is not explicitly an argument from Consequences, but it does break down that way. In that chapter of Lewis's book, Miracles, he essentially explains that any moral system based on naturalism cannot have real moral oughts. Since we all feel very strong moral oughts, these oughts are either illusions brought about by natural selection, or else morality is something that is apart from nature. The idea that they are illusions is unacceptable to Lewis, so he concludes that they really do exist and therefore are supernatural in origin. The funny thing is, Lewis actually does a decent job of explaining the origin of morality, including the feeling of moral oughts from a naturalistic perspective. He says, conscious organisms which behave in one way live longer than those which behave in another. Living longer, they are more likely to have offspring. Inheritance, and sometimes teaching as well, pass on their mode of behavior to their young. Thus, in every species, a pattern of behavior is built up. In the human species, conscious teaching plays a larger part in building it up, and the tribe further strengthens it by killing individuals who don't conform. They also invent gods who are said to punish departures from it. Thus, in time, there comes to exist a strong human impulse to conform. But since this impulse is often at variance with other impulses, mental conflict arises, and the man expresses it by saying, "I want to do A, but I ought to do B." Back to Dickie, he says that atheism cannot account for the presence of conscience or the knowledge of right and wrong, despite having just quoted a passage from a C.S. Lewis book where C.S. Lewis does a pretty decent job of explaining how atheism can, in fact, account for such things. Just because you don't like the way it's accounted for, doesn't mean that it hasn't been accounted for. He now quotes Michael Robinson, who seems to be his favorite. I just took a quick peek at the bibliography, and Michael Robinson is quoted in 4 of the 7 chapters of this book, as well as the introduction, and is the only apologist that is this heavily quoted. And his quotes so far have been, shall we say, less than stellar? Like, so far, he's the guy that we mostly just get quotes within quotes from. In the intro, Dickie quoted Robinson quoting Paul Vitz on how atheists all have bad relationships with their fathers. And in chapter 2, we get Robinson quoting C.S. Lewis about how he doesn't believe in the sun because he can see it, but because by its light he can see. Never mind that you can also just, see it. Let's see what Mikey Robs has for us today. Murder should be looked on as a good thing in the atheist worldview. If the creed is survival of the fittest, then those who murder are more fit than their victims. Okay, well, I see why we usually see Robinson quoting other people, because that just completely misses the mark. As C.S. Lewis explained, in a social species, the survival benefit comes with fitting into society. So in this case, the fittest is the person who fits in the best, and killing indiscriminately does not accomplish that. He goes on, if anything, they should delight in the killing of weaker members of an evolving species. Well, that's a terrifying insight into your psyche. If being a Christian is what's stopping you from delighting in the killing of people you perceive as weaker than yourself, then by all means continue to be a Christian. I wouldn't want to stop you. As for me, I have killed exactly as many people as I want to. 0. The quote keeps on going, though. He says, Christians can justify their outrage at murder. We do this through God's holy law. No other worldview can assert that murder is universally, unalterably, and objectively evil and remain consistent. Here's the thing, though. In order to make that assertion, you have to play word games. It's not killing another person that is universally, unalterably, and objectively evil. It's specifically murder, which is defined as the unlawful killing of another person. So this technicality gets you past all the heinous and immoral acts that God commands and commits in the Bible, like the genocides of enemy tribes, because God commanded them. Being commanded by God makes them legal, since we're using God's laws. Therefore, it's not technically murder when they take your infants and dash them upon the rocks. Though one wonders why the people who use this technicality to justify genocide, infanticide, patricide, filicide, and whatever other asides apply here are so hung up on being anti-abortion. It's not murder if it's not against the law, so as long as it's legal, it should be fine, right? Well, maybe it's against God's law. Except, no, it isn't. The only time anything close to abortion is mentioned in the Bible, it's when aborting a baby is part of the test of an unfaithful wife, or when God punishes people by having their soldiers rip open the pregnant women's wombs. I mean, to be fair, the Bible does call it evil when other tribes do it to Israel, but that seems a tad relativistic for someone who is talking about morality as though it is universal, unalterable, and objective. He concludes the chapter by quoting Greg Koukl, who says, "A moral atheist is like someone sitting down to dinner who doesn't believe in farmers, ranchers, fishermen, or cooks. She believes the food just appears with no explanation and no sufficient cause. This is silly. Either her meal is an illusion, or someone provided it. In the same way, if morals really exist, as we have argued, then some cause adequate to explain the effect must account for them. God is the most reasonable solution." Which is an interesting analogy, as it is quite literally the Christian who thinks that morality magically appears by way of God. Atheists have explanations that make sense in light of evolution, and those explanations also account for the differences in morality among different people, both on the individual level and cultural level. If morality is universal and in fact comes from God, there would be no disagreement, so y'all need to account for that. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from all the people who are fans of Greg Locke and found my short where I pointed out that if we use Greg Locke's definition of the word cult, his church is a cult. Welcome. Honestly, with how that short got a bit of a view boost around the time these comments started appearing, it wouldn't surprise me if Locke mentioned me in one of his sermons. If anyone has video of that, I would honestly love to see it, but I'll be damned if I'm going to sit through an entire unhinged Locke sermon just to find out whether or not he mentioned me. Anyway, thank you, followers of Greg Locke, for giving me a boost in the algorithm, both by watching the short and by commenting on it. Hell, even if you hit the dislike button, the algorithm still loves it. Engagement is engagement. It doesn't care what kind of engagement it is. Thanks for watching, thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorship manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Don Jackson, Chamber, Mark Bangs, Joaquin Berger, and Lore, who are the quotes within quotes that make up a surprisingly large percentage of my content. If you'd like to make it obvious how lazy my writing is, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Quick after the fact PSA, if you noticed a weird scraping kind of noise in the background during this video, it's because there was a guy here painting my living room and taking out the carpet. Yes, my partner has accomplished her sinister mission of using puddles to make the carpet that she hates smell like pee, thus requiring it to be removed, so that's why there's extra noise in the background of this one. But also, this is going at the end of the video because it was subtle enough that a lot of people won't notice it if it's not pointed out, so those people can still fully enjoy the video without that distraction, while those of you who do notice it still get your explanation. Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today I'm looking at chapter 4 of Pastor Dickie's The Problems with Atheism. This chapter is titled, There Are Many Questions the Atheist Cannot Answer. He gives a total of 30 questions, and this is his longest chapter so far, so this video could get a bit on the long side. So take a moment to pause the video, make yourself a cup of tea, wrap yourself up in a nice little blanket, curl up in your favorite chair, maybe grab a fur baby to cuddle with, and just generally get comfy. Much better. You know what? If you're in it for the long haul, why not click on the card in the corner or the link in the description in order to watch this entire series as a playlist? And if you'll recall, I have been playing Apologetics Bingo with this one. Here's what the bingo card looks like at this point. The last couple chapters saw a decrease in the frequency of completed squares, but this chapter picks up the pace, almost matching the introduction for the number of completed squares. Okay, so that's enough preamble. Let's get on to the video. On the first page, it's formatted such that I thought going in that we'd be spending the chapter discussing the 4 questions that are on this page. I'm actually kind of glad that I was wrong about that because questions 1 through 3 are essentially just the moral argument which we dealt with in chapter 3. Question 1 is what is right or wrong? I feel like I successfully addressed that in the previous video, so I'm not going to redo it here. Question 2 is how do you explain the presence of evil in the world? Easily, that's how. If there is no omnipotent being looking out for our best interests, then we would expect an uncaring impersonal universe to allow for scenarios that we would generally consider to be evil. Things like natural disasters, horrific diseases, the existence of parasites who have to make our lives miserable in order to survive themselves, etc. However, if there is an all-powerful God who loves us and wants what is best for us, then he wouldn't have created the diseases or parasites and would have designed the earth in a way that would not allow for natural disasters. The presence of what we generally call evil is an expectation of atheism, but Christian theism cannot account for it without selectively diminishing God's perfection and or power, either by having him create imperfect beings, meaning that he is either less than perfect and messed up, or that he is malicious rather than benevolent and made things imperfect on purpose, or he doesn't have all of the omni characteristics that Christians like to ascribe to him. He might not have had the power to create humans perfectly, so they would be able to resist the temptation of sin. Or he didn't know that putting the tree whose fruit would ruin his whole plan right in the middle of the garden, and having it grow fruit that was obviously delicious, would lead to Adam and Eve eating it. At any rate, I think this counts as the problem of evil uno reverse, as he is trying to say that evil couldn't even exist without God, therefore the problem of evil is actually a problem for atheists, because how would we explain evil without God? Question 3 is, on what authority do you make any judgment calls about what is good or evil? Which is the same as question 1 basically, and was dealt with in the previous video in this series. Question 4 is, where did matter come from? Quick and easy answer, the Big Bang. There was no matter at the Big Bang, only energy. When that energy expanded and cooled, that's when matter started forming. But we get our next bingo square here as he says, the explanation from agnostic Carl Sagan is as much a statement of faith as the Christian statement of faith, before going on to quote Sagan as saying the cosmos is all there is, or ever was, or ever will be, and comparing it to the liturgical hymn, to Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, the God whom we adore, be glory as it was, is now, and shall be evermore. So that gives us the it takes more faith to be an atheist square. Even though he says that Sagan is an agnostic, he is conflating this with atheism in this case. Otherwise, why even bother quoting an agnostic about the nature of the cosmos? But also, Sagan's quote is true as a matter of definition. Cosmos is a term that, cosmologically speaking, is used to describe, well, everything that is, or ever was, or ever will be. It is distinct from universe, as universe is for our local instantiation of space-time. There could be something that exists outside of our universe, and the word cosmos includes that. So really, if God exists, then by the nature of how definitions work, he would be a part of the cosmos. That statement says nothing about the existence of God. The liturgical hymn, on the other hand, is entirely assertive. That is, if we apply it to the cosmos as opposed to it being what it is. We love God and wish him the same glory now and forever that he has already had up until now. He then says that the cosmos is his God, so this gets us the atheism/science is a religion square, but again it's worth mentioning that Sagan was merely defining the word cosmos there. If God is, or ever was, or ever will be, then God is a part of the cosmos by definition. Therefore, the cosmos cannot itself be Sagan's God. Question 5 is, can something come from nothing? To which the simple answer is, maybe. Mathematically, it makes sense, but we've never actually observed a true nothing, and so we cannot be entirely certain how it would behave. So I guess this question is currently unanswerable, at least conclusively, but he begins his blurb on this question by saying, I find this incredible to believe. The atheist worldview would have us think that the entire world came from nothing. That is quite possibly the most obvious example of an argument from incredulity that I could ever even think of. He literally opens with a statement that flat out says he is incredulous about it. But more to the point here, atheism doesn't actually speak to the origin of the universe. Whether something can come from nothing or not is immaterial to atheism. We might not be able to answer the question, but that doesn't automatically make God the answer. But also, there are a bajillion potential answers to this question, most of which do not posit that something ever came from nothing. Once again, I won't go into that here, but I will leave a card to a video where I go over it more thoroughly. And now we come to the statement, it takes more faith to believe that than to believe in the God of the Bible. So if you weren't comfortable with me taking the more faith to be an atheist square earlier because of Sagan being an agnostic, this clinches it. He then goes on to say, if I have nothing in my hand, can I make something out of nothing? Actually, in my hand I would have something, such as air, molecules, atoms, etc. To have nothing in my hand, I would have to be in a perfect vacuum. To which I say, exactly. We've never observed nothing, so to make assertions about how it would or would not behave without any sort of evidence to back it up is completely unjustified. Now, I agree that intuitively it seems like nothing cannot give rise to something, but intuition is not very helpful in science. Intuitively, heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones, and this often plays out in the real world because heavier objects will be less affected by air resistance than lighter ones, generally speaking. But when you put two objects in a vacuum, the weight doesn't matter. They both fall with a downwards acceleration of 9.8 meters per second squared. This is entirely counterintuitive, and yet it is the case. So as counterintuitive as it may be to say that something can come from nothing, you cannot rule out that possibility based on intuition alone. He goes on to say that atheists would have us conclude that if we had, let's say, a lot of nothing, maybe a universe filled with nothing, that maybe we could create from that great big amount of nothing the world. But how could we have a universe of nothing? The universe would be something. To which I repeat, exactly. If the universe did in fact come from nothing, there would not have been a universe before the universe began, there would have been nothing. Pastor Dickie doesn't even seem to be capable of grasping the concept of the philosophical nothing that apologists usually argue for in cases like this, much less the quantum vacuum nothing that cosmologists are actually talking about when they discuss the one single model out of dozens that actually has a universe coming from nothing. Now, I was going to skip the rest of this question in order to not get bogged down in one of the 30 questions in this chapter, but then I saw that his source for something being unable to come from nothing is a song from The Sound of Music, which has the lyrics, "Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could." Like, Cosmologists who spend their entire careers trying to figure out the origin of the universe have said that it is possible that the universe did come from nothing. But Rodgers and Hammerstein disagree, so let's go with the musical. Okay, you know what? If we're going that route, Les Miserables is a better musical than The Sound of Music, and it has a song that contains the lyric, "Nothing changes." If nothing can change, then definitionally, something can come from it, as if you make a change to nothing, it now has at least one property and is therefore no longer nothing, but something. But, you might argue, this is a completely ridiculous argument. Of course it is. One should not base their view of the cosmos on lyrics from musicals. Question 6 is, what caused the Big Bang? And indeed, this is once again a question that the atheist cannot answer. And again, the lack of an answer does not automatically make God the correct answer. Though, amusingly, he claims that the idea of the Big Bang started with the philosopher Immanuel Kant. That's certainly a new one for me. I'm not exactly a philosophy buff, but when I think of Immanuel Kant, I think of his categorical imperative, which is the moral philosophy that essentially says that, morally speaking, you should take actions that you would universally wish that other people would take if they were in a similar situation. As far as cosmology goes, he did write about the antinomy of time, an antinomy being a philosophical problem that has two contradictory yet apparently necessary solutions. His reasoning was that the world must have a beginning in time, because otherwise an eternity must have already passed, which is impossible because no infinite series can be completed. But at the same time, the world cannot have a beginning in time, because that would imply a period of empty time. And in empty time, there would be nothing to distinguish one moment from another, and thus a change of any kind is impossible. So the world cannot have begun that way. So rather than the Big Bang originating with Kant, the Big Bang actually solves the antinomy. Time itself had a beginning, and that beginning was roughly simultaneous with the world, or rather the universe to update the language a bit. Now, maybe Pastor Dickie is referring to something else that Kant wrote that actually is more relevant, but without reading Kant's entire life's work, I can't know that for sure, as Dickie doesn't cite this claim. It actually comes across as a rather superfluous name drop. He doesn't go on to discuss Kant's ideas, he just says, the Big Bang originated with Kant, and then moves on, satisfied that he has sufficiently impressed his readers with his pseudo-intellectualism. Anyway, his next sentence right after crediting Kant for the Big Bang is, not everyone, even non-believers, accept the Big Bang theory, which just serves to demonstrate that this is not a necessary part of the so-called atheistic worldview. Which then leaves us wondering, why is this question even here if it's not part of atheism? In fact, not only are there atheists who do not accept the Big Bang, there are also Christians who do accept it. So it seems like the acceptance of the Big Bang is independent of God belief. We now get a quote from biologist Ernst Peter Fischer, who says, "A society which accepts the idea that the origin of the cosmos could be explained in terms of an explosion reveals more about the society itself than about the universe." To which I would respond that a person who refers to the Big Bang as an explosion reveals more about the person themselves than about the Big Bang. And now we come to an analogy that Dickie was so proud of that he put it in one of those little text blocks meant to emphasize a particularly good or clever point. Pieces of an exploding grenade do not revolve in alignment or orbits. They scatter in random directions. This is just brutally asinine. The pieces of the grenade might appear to move randomly to the casual observer, but each piece was given its velocity by the force of the explosion, and it follows its trajectory perfectly in mathematical alignment once you account for all the variables. If you take a grenade out into deep space, far from any stars or any other big sources of gravity, and blow it up, you'll find that the shrapnel does indeed eventually start to come together to orbit the gravitational center of the system. That is, the shrapnel that wasn't propelled away at greater than the escape velocity of the system, which admittedly would be the vast majority of it. But that which is left would form little orbits around each other, clumping together over time, because that's just how physics work. Next up, question 7 gives us the fine-tuning square, and our first single-line bingo. Can complexity and mathematical precision come from a random explosion? For this question, he sticks to Fred Hoyle's tornado in a junkyard analogy, which notably neither tornado nor a junkyard are nothing. So with the picture of the atheist worldview that Dickie is painting, this analogy just doesn't hold up. Question 8 is, how do you explain the presence of non-material thought, logic, and reasoning? 2 words, brain chemistry. Question 9 is, apart from God and the Bible, how do you define love and hate? With the dictionary. Love, noun, an intense feeling of deep affection, a great interest and pleasure in something. Verb, feel deep affection for, like or enjoy very much. Hate, verb, feel intense or passionate dislike for. Noun, intense or passionate dislike. Boom. Done. I thought these were questions I shouldn't be able to answer. Question 10 is, how do you explain the fulfilled prophecies of the scriptures? Very easily, actually. Most of what Christians call fulfilled prophecies aren't even prophecies, and are so forced that I have a hard time believing that apologists who use the fulfilled prophecy argument have actually read them. Again, I'll leave a card to a video where I go into more detail and actually look at some of the so-called prophecies, but I have a question for Pastor Dickie here. How does he explain the failed prophecies of Scripture if his God actually exists? Last I checked, Nebuchadnezzar never conquered Egypt. Also, the city of Tyre still exists, despite God proclaiming that it would never be rebuilt. And while Nebuchadnezzar did besiege Tyre, he never conquered it in the way the Bible says he would. So the clear prophecies have a tendency to fail, but just to give one example of the supposedly fulfilled prophecies that apologists like to say prove the Bible true, Genesis chapter 5 verse 24 is supposed to be a prophecy of Jesus' bodily ascension into heaven. Genesis 5:24 says, "Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." That is what passes for fulfilled prophecies to an apologist, and it's not like I went digging for a bad one. That was number 3 from a list of 351 prophecies. You'd think they'd lead with their best, but I guess not. Question 11. How do you explain the resurrection of Christ? It didn't happen. Question 12. How do you know your worldview is true? By being willing to adjust my worldview to fit reality instead of demanding that reality conform to my worldview. Easy peasy. 13. What do you do with guilt? Feel it? If you mean how do you free yourself from guilt, then honestly, ditching the religion that demonizes natural bodily functions was a huge step in that direction. Like, I really don't get this question. Making people feel guilty for shit that doesn't matter is a huge part of Christianity. The only thing I can think of for this one is that Christianity offers forgiveness by proxy. That is, if you harm someone, Christianity allows you to not seek forgiveness from the person that you actually harmed, instead getting forgiveness from God. So even if the person you harmed never forgives you, you don't need to feel guilty about it because God forgave you. And honestly, that's kinda gross. Even in the versions of Christianity that emphasize taking actions to earn the actual person's forgiveness, if they don't forgive you, you still get to forget about any guilt because God forgave you. And honestly, that's just not how forgiveness should work. But alas, Dickie doesn't elaborate on this question. It apparently was supposed to be self-explanatory, but it wasn't. Question 14. What provides the preconditions that make reality intelligible? This is a question that obviously comes from presuppositionalism, and is the kind of language that is typical of Dr. Greg Bahnsen, who we heard from in Chapter 2. It's essentially the transcendental argument for God, which, funnily enough, actually does originate with Kant, but not in a he said something that kinda seemed like it if you look at it sideways kinda way that we saw for the Big Bang, but in a he actually was the person credited for the argument's development kinda way. And essentially it breaks down to logic and morality are immaterial and so cannot have a material source, therefore God. Which doesn't actually follow. It's one of those arguments whose main purpose is to impress an audience with complicated sophistry rather than making an actual point. The whole argument rests on the assumption that immaterial things, like the laws of logic, cannot have material sources, like minds, and I just don't see why I should accept that assumption. But this leads us to the next question, 15. Where did the laws of logic come from? Answer? Our minds. We created the laws of logic to describe how the universe works. There is nothing transcendental about them. If the universe worked differently, we would have created different laws to describe it. But these questions actually get us to the logical version of the Euthyphro dilemma. Ask an apologist if God can make a rock so heavy that he cannot lift it, and they will likely tell you that no, he cannot. And not because he's not omnipotent, but because he can only do that which is logically possible, which means that God is subject to the laws of logic. He cannot change them. So even if we accept the transcendental argument, it's not proof of God, it's proof of a transcendental source for the laws of logic that God himself is subject to. Question 16 is, what is the meaning of life? Answer, whatever you want it to be. You get to choose your own meaning. Do what you find fulfilling. But here we get our Michael Robinson quote for this chapter, where he says that the ultimate purpose of the atheist is, ultimately, that you have no purpose. Pondering this can only envelop you with hopelessness and despondency. So that gives us the atheist or nihilist square and our second and third single line bingos, but having no ultimate purpose, far from enveloping me with hopelessness or despondency, actually fills me with a sense of freedom. My purpose is my own to decide. Nobody else can say what my purpose is except for me. And who gets to decide if I have accomplished my purpose? I do. But Robinson goes on to say that our ultimate purpose is to be in relationship with Jesus Christ as the person he created. Like, honestly, if I knew that the whole purpose of my life was just to have Jesus as my boyfriend, that'd make me feel kinda hopeless and despondent. There's so much more to life than going to church. And honestly, going to church gets in the way of some of the most fulfilling aspects of life, like spending quality time with people that you love, waking up slowly on a Sunday morning, hearing the kids playing while cuddling up to your partner before finally getting out of bed and cooking a nice breakfast while still in your pajamas. That's honestly one of the most emotionally satisfying experiences that I have ever had, and I get to do that every single week. Now, granted, some days the kids playing devolves into screaming matches that require adult attention, but I wouldn't trade it for anything, not even an eternity worshipping Jesus, which actually sounds quite boring and unfulfilling. Question 17 is, how do you know evolution is true? My Evidence for Evolution series explains that, but to keep it simple, do you mean how do we know evolution is true aside from having directly observed it? Because we have directly observed it. Creationists love to invent imaginary roadblocks that keep the evolution that we observe from becoming the evolution that they are in denial about. He mentions now that evolution is an unproven theory, which shows us that he doesn't know the difference between how the word theory is used colloquially and how it is used scientifically. Shocker, I know. But then he gives us a lengthy quote from Dr. John Blanchard about a group of scientists who reject the theory of evolution. Before getting into the list, I'd just like to point out that Dr. Blanchard is not only not a biologist, but his doctoral degree is an honorary doctor of divinity. And typically, someone with an honorary doctorate would only be called doctor by the institution that awarded the degree rather than by the general public. It's a minor quibble, but Dickie's shown that he has a penchant for trying to gain credibility by association, so I felt it was worth mentioning. On to the list of scientists who reject the theory of evolution. It's just a list and quotes from those scientists. I'm not going to read the actual quotes, but I will put them on the screen. It starts with Ambrose Fleming, an electrical engineer, not a biologist, who was also very religious and died in 1945, which was before the structure of DNA was even discovered. The next quote is from Nobel Prize winner Robert Millikan, again, not a biologist, a physicist, who was, again, deeply religious, and again, died before the structure of DNA was discovered. Okay, he died the year that discovery was published, so maybe not quite before, but close enough. Also, he was a strong proponent of theistic evolution, meaning that he did, in fact, accept evolution, he just thought that God did it. On top of all that, this quote is reported secondhand from the 1916 pamphlets on the Catholic Church. So we have a secondhand report of a guy who accepted evolution saying that evolution is something that no scientist can prove in 1916, a time when our scientific knowledge about evolution was such that it was not impossible at the time that some future discovery would falsify it, though even then, such a discovery was highly implausible. Next, we get a quote from Colin Patterson, finally, an actual biologist. But this is a list of scientists who reject evolution, and Colin Patterson literally wrote textbooks on evolution and regretted making statements that creationists could take out of context to make it look like he doubted evolution, saying in a later edition of the very book that this quote is pulled from, "When I published the first edition of this book, I was hardly aware of creationism, but during the 1980s, like many other biologists, I learned that one should think carefully about candor in argument in publications, lectures, or correspondences, in case one was furnishing creationist campaigns with ammunition in the form of quotable quotes, often taken out of context." The final scientist, and this time I am using the word scientist very loosely, is Henry Morris, who was indeed an engineer, again not a biologist, but is widely considered to be the founder of modern young earth creationism. Pretty much all creationist arguments that you'll come across today originate with Morris, though they have tried to update them occasionally to make them seem fresher than they are. He ends this section with a Dawkins quote. It's the one about people who don't believe in evolution being either ignorant, stupid, insane, or wicked, and follows it up by saying, "The prejudice of these new atheists underscores the deep inner hatred they have toward anyone who dares question their worldview. It is shameful." And I only bring this up because if you thought I was too eager to take the Dawkins as authority square in the last video, this firms it up. Question 18 is, don't the presence of moral laws presuppose the presence of an absolute moral code taught by a moral God? No, Not at all. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that there are no moral laws that are inherent to the universe. Morality is dependent upon the existence of moral actors, beings who have the capacity to think about morality and understand that their actions are either right or wrong. In the absence of such beings, morality does not exist. So morality is contingent upon the existence of subjects, making morality subjective by definition. Question 19 is, how do you know that slavery is wrong? Which is rich, coming from a guy advocating for a moral code found in a book that explains how long you're allowed to keep your Hebrew slaves, how to sell your daughter into sex slavery, where you can get your permanent chattel slaves, and tells slaves to obey their masters with respect and fear. So I know that slavery is wrong because I have empathy. You can't say that slavery is wrong because a book that you believe has the absolute moral code in it tells you that slavery is allowed. If you do think that slavery is wrong, you have to jump through a bunch of apologetic hoops in order to make the slavery of ancient Israel seem less bad than it would have actually been, while ignoring the bits about taking foreigners as permanent chattel slaves. Question 20 is, how do you know that torturing people is wrong? Again, I have empathy. And again, you believe in a God who is going to eternally torture the people who didn't believe in him. So if you believe that torture is wrong, then you disagree with God. Question 21 is, what evidence do you have to support the theory that time plus chance equals complexity? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that experiment from 2016 where 2 types of self-replicating RNA were placed in a test tube ecosystem, and over the course of a few hundred rounds of replication, the 2 types of RNA spontaneously evolved into 5 distinct types of RNA which had complex parasitic and cooperative relationships with each other. And when I was trying to find the website that explained this finding, I found a 2020 paper that documented the spontaneous emergence of self-replicating molecules that contain nucleobases and amino acids, a pretty big step forward in origin of life research. Question 22 is, where did the information come from that is programmed into the DNA code? Well, for starters, DNA isn't a code in the sense that creationists usually mean it, like a computer code. It's a chemical, deoxyribonucleic acid. And it doesn't contain information in the same sense that a book contains information. Anyway, information is once again one of those topics that is too big for this video, so I'll leave yet another card to yet another video where I cover this topic in more detail. It's actually the last card that YouTube will let me add. Question 23 is, does not the information in the DNA code make evolution impossible? No, it does not. This question is essentially the same as the last question, so I'll skip most of it, but he does at one point say if you saw graffiti on a wall in the city, you would know that someone painted the message on that wall. So I'll go ahead and take the paintings need painters square, which gets us another vertical line. 4 bingos in 1 chapter, who knew? And we've still got 7 questions to go, so there might be more. Later in this question, we get to Dickie asking a sub-question. Has there ever been a process anywhere observed where non-intelligent activities create information? To which the answer is an overwhelming and resounding yes. Literally everything contains information and creates information when it does anything. The crystalline structure of a cooling rock is information. The pattern of sticks that have fallen off trees in a windstorm is information. The structure of every molecule of everything is information. The problem here, though, is that Pastor Dickie is of the opinion that all of this was actually supervised by God, so none of these examples will work against his argument because literally everything has to be created in his worldview, meaning that we have no example of an uncreated object with which to compare. And when push comes to shove, comparison is how we know that something is designed. We don't know that a watch was designed by any inherent property of the watch. We know it because of our human experience. That's where watches come from. But in the watchmaker example, we know the watch is designed by comparing it to a rock as an obvious example of a thing that was not designed. Except in the Christian worldview, both were designed, so the comparison ceases to have any meaning. Question 24 once again brings us back to the moral argument. Does atheism have an explanation for the complex moral and ethical issues facing mankind? Yes. Yes, it does, and I have given it. Question 25 shows off Pastor Dickie's penchant for verbosity again by asking, if you got up in the morning and saw a box of alphabet cereal on the table with a message spelled out, "I love my wife very much," would you naturally assume that the cat knocked over the box and the letters spilled out and spelled this message by chance? No, I would not think that. Again, I ask, I thought these were supposed to be questions that we cannot answer. 26 is, where in the fossil record are transitional forms between invertebrate organisms and vertebrate organisms? And for this question, he simply provides a single quote from, surprisingly enough, an actual biologist, Pierre-Paul Grasset. Unfortunately for Pastor Dickie, he chose one of the last proponents of Lamarckian evolution to quote from, meaning that he fully accepted evolution but disagreed about how it worked. The quote that he pulled was just him saying that we don't have fossil evidence for the origin of the various phyla. This evidence is admittedly rather poor even today, but we're talking about fossils of tiny organisms that lived 500 million years ago. The fact that we have any fossil evidence at all is rather impressive. But it's interesting to me that you have to go back to the origin of all vertebrates in order to find a spot with a missing link. We do have some candidate fossils that could fill in that gap, but if evolution were not actually true, you wouldn't need to resort to finding gaps in the Precambrian. You should be able to show us a fossil record that has no transitional fossils whatsoever, but you can't, because we have plenty of them. Now, to satisfy the pedants, when I say transitional here, I'm referring to a series of fossils that demonstrates a transition. I am aware that almost any fossil could technically be called transitional as long as we assume that it wasn't the very last member of its species. We have the transition from land mammals to whales. We have the transition from tiny horse-like creatures to modern horses. The transition from water-dwelling fish to land-dwelling tetrapods. The transition from non-human ape to humans. And more. Question 27 is, what is the advantage of an organism having half a wing on the way to a full wing? Answer? Warmth, flapping it to increase running speed, mating displays, stuff like that. Why don't you ask an ostrich? They have half wings that don't work for flying, but which they do use for mating displays and balance while running. If it's useful for an ostrich, why would it not be useful for a bird ancestor? Question 28 is, can life come from non-life? Which is close enough to give us the how did life begin without God square, which gives us another 2 bingo lines, and leaves us with only 3 unclaimed squares, and 4 chapters in the conclusion to go. But to answer the question, yes. It happens all the time. The digestion process is literally building a living being out of non-living material. Now, sure, most of the material that we eat used to be alive, but the death of whatever we eat is a key component of digestion, whether it's happening before or after we eat it. And so we build our living bodies out of non-living material. All you need for life to exist is for the resources that it needs to be present. The very first thing to exist that we would have called life would have been very simple and would have fed off of non-living resources that it could find in its environment. And we have determined that such resources would have been abundant on the early Earth. Question 29 is, if there is no God and there are no absolutes, what gives man any more value than rocks, reptiles, trees, or termites? We do. As a human, I inherently value human life over the existence of rocks, once again because of empathy. And finally, we reach question 30. Can intelligence come from non-intelligence? Yes. The gestalt that is the human experience comes from the cooperation of trillions of cells, each of which we would call alive if it were growing in a petri dish without the rest of a human attached to it, none of which is itself intelligent. So, to ask this question, you are either committing the composition fallacy, where you assert that intelligence cannot be the result of interactions of non-intelligent cells and molecules, or you are committing the genetic fallacy in claiming that intelligent descendants could not evolve from unintelligent ancestors. Now, at this point he begins his conclusion rather abruptly, and format-wise, it looks like it's supposed to be the explanation for the final question rather than the beginning of the conclusion. But anyway, he says, we are trying to show the problems that atheism has with its own faulty presuppositions. Trying and failing, I'd say. The atheist often has the attitude that says, it's my opinion and it's quite true. Which, again, I'd like to point out so far in this book, Dickie hasn't given us much more than his own opinion. And anytime he has attempted to venture into the realm of facts or evidence, he winds up being wildly incorrect. That's it for this one. Okay, that wasn't too bad. I nearly turned it into an 1.5 hour long video with tangents, but I did manage to restrain myself by linking to other material instead of re-explaining all of that. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Donovan Allen, who says, imagine creating the universe and creating life out of inanimate matter, and the beings get cocky enough to think they came from nothing and that you don't exist. Here's the thing, Donovan. The easy solution to that is for the creator to not do his best job at hiding from the beings that he created. If he wants us to believe in him, he could at least pop in and say hi. Also, your comment points out another issue with question 28, can life come from non-life? Creationists believe that it did, so if the answer to that question is no, then that means that creationism can't be true either, except that they special plead their way out of it by appealing to magic. Thanks for watching, thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the questions that are easily answered by the atheism that is my channel. If you'd like apologists to think that you're some sort of gotcha, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today, I'm headed into Chapter 5 of Pastor Dickie's The Problems with Atheism book. Click the card in the corner to watch this series as a playlist if you missed the previous chapters. This is the dark chapter, which may as well just be called Godwin's Law, but typical of Dickie's verbosity, it is instead titled The Atheist Cannot Escape the Dilemma That His Worldview is Responsible for So Much Inhumanity to Man. Anyway, if you're following along with the bingo board, I'm just going to go ahead and preemptively take the Stalin/Mao/Hitler/etc. were atheist square, because that's pretty much all this chapter is. This might end up being a shorter installment in this series, because there's only so many ways that I can say those guys are not representative of atheism as a whole, and if you think that they are, then you have to come to grips with the fact that your worldview has caused at least as much inhumanity to man as atheism, and to a significantly greater degree if we assume that the stories in the Bible are true. So, with our bingo game for this chapter finished before we even begin, let's get on to the video! But first, I'm actually going to be issuing a content warning for this one. I don't get into graphic descriptions, but I do talk about some stuff that might be upsetting to some people, mostly Jeffrey Dahmer related. I'll put chapters in this video to make that part easy to skip, so with that out of the way, let's go! The chapter opens with the statement, "The rise of Darwinian atheism in the 20th century led to the rise of Stalinism, Nazism, and totalitarianism." This is a statement that is not entirely false, but it is oversimplified to such a great degree that it may as well be false. If we look to the writings of people like Marx and Engels, we see a nuanced view of religion. Yes, they called it the opiate of the people and the sigh of the oppressed creature, but they also called it the heart of a heartless world. They saw religion as something that had satisfactorily been shown to be false by the intellectuals and philosophers of the 18th century, and those who remained religious did so not as a matter of intellect, but of social need. So there is no need under Marxism to persecute religion or to fight against it. It will die on its own when it ceases to be necessary. And there is actually something to this. The Marxist view does also lack nuance, though to a lesser degree than Pastor Dickie, but not only is there a correlation between religion and poverty, with more impoverished areas tending to be more religious, but there's also evidence to suggest that some causality is there. That is, that high levels of religiosity can, if not directly cause poverty, at least contribute to it. For example, it is well established that higher levels of education lead to a decrease in poverty and a general increase in economic output, but in some religious cultures, people are encouraged to get married and have kids fairly young, something that can get in the way of an education. And often in these religious cultures, it is taught that your economic position is predetermined by God, or the gods, at your birth. These religions promote the status quo by promising more in the afterlife than you could ever hope to obtain in this life. So be a good little worker bee slaving away in whatever destitution you find yourself in, and you'll be rewarded with a solid gold mansion after you die. Such ideas are way more emotionally appealing to people who have no hope in this life than to those who already live relatively good lives. Of course, like I said, this view lacks nuance. Even if religion contributes to keeping people in poverty, it is not solely responsible, and contrary to Marx's opinion, I highly doubt that religion would just up and vanish if earthly society became a utopia. So that's Marx, but Dickie mentions Stalinism. What of that? Well, the thing is, Marx never really laid out an actual system of government in his writings. So the governments that arose using the name communism were born of the desire to enact the principles found in Marx's writings, but had to kind of figure out the whole governance thing on their own. And specific to Russia, not a whole lot changed for most people when the government transitioned from czarist to communist. There was a civil war that lasted several years after the initial revolution that put Lenin in power, in which both communists and the White Guard, an alliance of czarists, right-wingers, and anti-communist left-wingers, used terrorism to further their goals, which did a bunch of damage to Russia's already weakened agricultural and economic systems. Stalin, throughout the whole thing, was a high-ranking general. He was the one that suggested the execution of the czarist government officials and royal family to Lenin, Lenin. Stalin was bloodthirsty, power-hungry, and opportunistic, to a degree that even Lenin dictated instructions warning of his dangerous disposition and advising that he be removed from power. Lenin died shortly after leaving those instructions, and Stalin was able to suppress them, remaining in a position of power and gradually getting rid of anybody in the Communist Party who opposed him. Now, this does not exonerate Lenin from wrongdoing, like there's this misconception about communism that Lenin was the good one and Stalin was the bad one, but Lenin was perfectly willing to use Stalin's ambition as long as it benefited him. My point here is that it was not atheism that drove the communist revolution, it was dissatisfaction with the status quo. People were angry about having poor working conditions and low wages. People were starving to death while the czars were throwing lavish parties in their palace. People were fed up. Communism promised food, peace, and prosperity. It didn't deliver on those promises, but the people who lived through that time had no way of knowing how badly it would go. They still had shitty working conditions and low wages, they were still starving while those on the top were feasting, and none of it had anything to do with atheism, except maybe tangentially. Stalin did certainly oppose the church and did persecute all religions, but that was not because of a push for atheism, that was because he saw organized religion as competition. He wanted people to worship the government. He understood how religion was used to control the masses, and wanted that control to belong to the government, and by proxy him. It's not atheism that caused the tragedies of the communist regime's rule of terror, it was desire to maintain power and control. Now, with that in mind, shall we compare it to religion? How many have died as a direct result of religion trying to maintain or even expand their power and control? Yes, the Crusades had an overall lower death toll, about 5 million compared to the 100 million that died to communism, but when we look at it as the proportion of the total population, I actually have no idea because I'm not a statistician, and calculating the average percentage of a population to be killed in the Crusades every year over a period of 200 years as opposed to the average percentage of a population killed by communism over a period of about 80 years, when the population of the world was growing significantly faster during the 80-year period than it was during the 200-year period, is just beyond my skill level. But my point remains, by proportion of the population, religion had a massive death toll as well, and if we go back to pretending that the stories in the Bible literally happened, then we wind up with a malevolent God who killed greater than 99.99% of the world population in one fell swoop, a feat that no governmental regime, no matter how brutal, has ever accomplished. So yeah, in terms of absolute numbers, communism might win the brutality Olympics, but that's mainly because the rise of communism happened to coincide with a massive rise in world population, as well as the rapid development of new technologies that were capable of killing people much more efficiently than the swords, spears, and arrows of the Crusades. I imagine it would be a different story if either the Christians or Muslims had access to tanks, automatic weapons, and massive bombs, both nuclear and otherwise, during the Crusades. All this to say that it's people. People do bad things to other people in the pursuit of power and wealth. Sometimes they use religion as their tool to keep the general populace in line. Sometimes they use political ideologies. Sometimes they use fear and intimidation. Most often, they use a combination of the three. Anyway, remember when I said this was going to be a short video? Yeah, we're literally one sentence into the chapter so far. But hey, I put a bunch of nuance into this claim that should mostly clear it up. So maybe I can skip past a bunch of the, but also Hitler, but also wait, no, all we got is communists and Hitler type stuff. And keep that in mind. For atheism, they have communist governments and Hitler. For Christianity, we have the Crusades, the Inquisition, the residential schools, the domestic terrorism, the financial mismanagement, the sexual abuse of both children and adults, and more, all spanning decades to centuries to probably realistically millennia. Oh yeah, and they have to fudge past the Hitler stuff too, because well, he might have been an atheist privately. I don't think he was, but he could have been. He didn't use atheism to accomplish those ends. He used Christianity. Anyway, to skip past a bunch of stuff that I've already dealt with to get to the second page of the chapter, we get him saying that, while the Bible teaches the sanctity of all human life and teaches that all men are made in the image of God, atheism creates the basis and rationale, to devalue human life. Aside from the fact that he's excluding women from having been made in the image of God with his choice of language here, it is worth mentioning that God commanded and committed many genocides in the Bible. This is incompatible with the idea that all human life is sacred. If all human life is sacred, then genocide should be the absolute worst sin you could possibly commit. And yet, God doesn't seem to consider genocide to be a sin. Kill all the Canaanites. Kill all the men, women, and children who live in Jericho. Kill all the Amalekites. Hell, just kill all the humans except for Noah and his immediate family. But yeah, the guy that commanded all of those atrocities surely thought that human life was sanctified and precious because men were made in his image. He then states that because of the influence of atheism, we now have to wrestle with international problems of population elimination, abortion, and euthanasia, prostitution, pornography, the sex slave trade, and illegal drugs. Now, first and foremost, figure out what you want to do with your commas there. Like, that was really hard for me to read because it just didn't make any sense, and I emphasized it in a weird way because of how it's written. Like, there was an attempt at an Oxford comma just before euthanasia, which got abandoned as he just continued the list, only to end it without the Oxford comma. I definitely prefer the Oxford comma, but I understand that it's just a convention. It's not worth a sick tag just for not using it, but you can't use an Oxford comma in the middle of the list and then remember that you have more items on the list just to make it one list. Now, all of that aside, do you honestly think that none of these things were issues without atheism? Now, sure, a number of them are things that atheists generally don't consider inherently bad, porn and sex work for instance, but what's with the population elimination one? Is Dickie a conspiracy theorist who thinks that the evil atheists are trying to cull the world population for some unknown reason? The only evidence for such a plot is on the Georgia Guidestones, which are supposed to be principles to build a society on after we mostly wipe ourselves out with war or environmental destruction or whatever. So the one about keeping the population to 500 million is meant for a population that has already been seriously reduced. It's not advocating that we actively engage in population reduction in order to get there, but all that's kind of beside the point because the vast majority of atheists don't take the Georgia Guidestones seriously anyway. Abortion is a matter of bodily autonomy more than that of atheism. On top of that, the only mention of abortion in the Bible is either when soldiers slice open the wombs of pregnant women in an act of violence that is sometimes directly commanded by God, or the test for unfaithfulness in which a priest will prepare a potion, and if God himself steps in and aborts the baby after the woman has taken the potion, then she was unfaithful to her husband. So abortion is sometimes commanded by God, and sometimes performed directly by God, but is never condemned. The sex slave trade is, again, something that is endorsed by the Bible. Exodus 21 verses 7 through 11 explains how a Hebrew man can sell his daughter into sex slavery if he wants to. Deuteronomy 20 verses 10 through 14 explain how to take sex slaves after conquering a city. Numbers 31 verses 17 through 18 has Moses commanding soldiers to kill all the boys, men, and women who are not virgins, while taking the young virgin girls as sex slaves. But in my experience, atheists are pretty unanimous in their hatred of sex slavery and human trafficking. Now really, if we want to compare the morals of atheism to the morals of religious people, here's a fun little experiment that you guys can try. Find an atheist organization and Google its name, followed by the word scandal. Do you know what you'll find? Generally speaking, there will either be nothing, or there will be someone who lost their position of authority as a consequence of their bad actions. American Atheist scandal? Silverman fired for sexual misconduct. Atheists of Florida scandal? Nothing. American Humanist Association? Dawkins retroactively losing an award for being transphobic. But pick a Christian denomination, and before you even start looking, you already know exactly what you're going to find. A bunch of scandals surrounding not only the sexual abuse of children, but of the church actively working to keep the scandals under wraps and protecting the perpetrators of the abuse from having to face any sorts of consequences. Southern Baptist scandal? A 200-page report outlining hundreds of church leaders sexually abusing children, with the churches covering it up. Catholic Church scandal? Play the same game again, but pick any random diocese. We all know that story. Lutheran? The Evangelical Lutheran Church had a scandal where a guy who hadn't even been ordained yet was known to have had a history of inappropriate conduct with boys. Church officials covered it up and ordained him anyways. Then they moved him to a new church when it became apparent that he had a chronic problem with exposing himself to boys in bathrooms. They didn't warn the new congregation of his behavior, and now they owe tens of millions of dollars in damages to his victims. So yeah, if you want to claim to be judging atheism based on the consequences of an atheist worldview, then it seems that Christianity has a lot more to answer for than atheism. Those who are taught that there is no God, no moral absolutes, and no final judgment day coming are being given freedom to become human monsters, says the man advocating for an organization known for protecting child rapists and avoiding taxes whenever possible. He does acknowledge at this point that not every atheist is as wicked as can be, and while I do agree with that, I would ask why he disagrees with the Bible. Psalm 14:1 says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good." That is pretty clearly saying that those who say that there is no God are incapable of doing good. So I wonder why Dickie is okay with ignoring that part of the Bible. especially given that he doesn't seem to have a problem quoting the first half of that verse. The next bit is a fairly lengthy quote from an article on why atheism and evolution caused the Columbine shooting, followed by another lengthy quote from the same article, but this time about one of the 3 total school shootings that Finland has ever experienced. Notably, the article that Dickie is quoting doesn't seem to recognize the difference between an example and a causal relationship. The Columbine bit is, of course, used as an example of the shooters believing that they were more highly evolved, and then the section on the Finnish shooting starts with the statement, "Another example of this type of relationship between atheism and immoral behavior comes from Finland." The obvious conclusion that they want us to draw here is that atheism causes school shootings. But if that were true, then you'd expect Finland, a country with roughly similar proportions of Christians and unaffiliated people as the United States, to have roughly similar proportions of school shootings. But Finland has had 3 school shootings. Not 3 this year, 3 total. The US has had 19 so far this year. So that doesn't track. There's also the fact that atheists are underrepresented in prison. In the entirety of the United States federal prison system, there are a total of 143 inmates that are atheists, with an additional 63 being secular humanists. This adds up to a whopping 0.1% of the prison population. Given that atheists make up about 4% of the general population, we'd expect them to make up more than 4% of the prison population if atheists actually have a greater proclivity for living a life of crime and violence. Of course, these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt. Despite being illegal to discriminate against someone based on their religious beliefs, or lack thereof, there are well-known benefits to being religious while in prison. In addition to having extra free time to associate with fellow believers, judges, prison guards, and parole boards are more likely to see you in a more favorable light if you are known to be religious. So these numbers aren't exactly a clincher for this argument. But, I mean, in Dickie's mind, we're already talking about people who believe in God but are so angry at him that they pretend to not believe in him in order to live immoral lives, and I can't really see such a person being willing to take on the Christian label in order to escape certain aspects of punishment, given that they actively reject it, knowing that that rejection will lead to an ultimate punishment. So you either have to accept that atheists really don't believe in God, unlike what Romans 1:20 says, or you have to accept that Christians are more likely to be criminals than atheists. After that lengthy quote, he brings up Nietzsche again, this time calling him the architect of the God is dead movement, which is not actually a thing, at least not that I could find. There is something called Death of God theology, which is actually a largely Christian theological movement from the 18th to the early 20th century. There were several versions of it, but my favorite is the one that actually manages to make the Trinity make sense. God the Father was negated and effectively died when Jesus came onto the scene. And Jesus' death in this version is actually a sacrifice, as that is literally the death of that form of God, with the Holy Spirit being brought into being to take over after Jesus' death. Dickie goes on to call Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini students of Nietzsche, which I find interesting given that Stalin labeled Nietzsche the philosopher of fascism. But that's beside the point, as we now immediately transition to another story of a school-related killing. This time, it was of a robbery gone wrong, where 2 kids attempted to rob a couple of college professors, with the plan being to threaten them into giving them their PIN numbers. Yes, I know it's a tautology, suck it. The way they got into the house was by pretending to be students doing research for a school survey. The killing started when the professor chastised one of them for not being better prepared with his research questions, resulting in the kid getting angry and stabbing him. But what I find most interesting about this particular story is how Dickie ties it into the topic. He claims that these 2 young students named Robert and Jim read some Nietzsche and then went on a murder rampage, confessing afterward that Nietzsche had convinced them that God is dead and no moral values existed. In previous stories of shootings or killings, Dickie has not shied away from using the full names for anyone in the story. This time, though, it's Robert and Jim killing 2 beloved Dartmouth professors. This is a bit suspicious, especially since when you look it up, not only does James go by James and not Jim, but there is no mention of Nietzsche or a philosophical moral discussion at the trial. Just a typical robbery gone wrong kind of story, which makes me think that Dickie obscured the information just enough to make it harder to research, but not enough to be representing a completely fictitious event. Though really with how he represented it, it basically is completely fictitious. At this point, I'd normally call this the moment where I'm comfortable saying that Dickie is lying rather than just being ignorant, but honestly with him, it wouldn't surprise me if he were under the impression that every word he wrote in this book is true, but he's just copying bad information without properly vetting or attributing it. But, I mean, that's a kind of dishonesty on its own, so either way, Dickie is being dishonest. And yes, you can apply this opinion retroactively to the previous chapters. After he's done blaming atheism for individual murders and shootings where at best it was only tangentially related and at worst it wasn't even a factor to begin with, he turns to the writings of Aldous Huxley in order to support the statement that many of those who embraced atheism did so because of their desire to live immoral lives without guilt. To achieve this, they had to kill God and deny the word of God in order to sin without guilt. I'll get to the Huxley quote in a moment, but first I would just like to point out that the ability to behave immorally without guilt is something that Christianity accomplishes by offering a system of forgiveness by proxy. Did you do something that hurt someone else? Sure, feel guilty about it, but then confess that sin to the Lord and rest easy in the knowledge that He has forgiven you and has washed your sins away. Remember Jeffrey Dahmer? Interesting detail about his story that is often left out when apologists use him as an example of what atheism causes people to do, is that before he converted to Christianity in prison, while being arrested, he said, "For what I did, I should be dead." In later interviews after his conversion to Christianity, he said if a person doesn't think there's a God to be accountable to, what's the point in trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? Which is a typical type of thing to hear from apologists, so if I had to guess, I'd say that this was a thought that he retroactively applied to his life, rather than something that he actively thought while committing his crimes. But my point is, before he became a Christian, he admitted to feeling guilty for what he had done. After he became a Christian, he was able to release his guilt without ever requiring that the friends and families of his victims forgive him, stating, "I have accepted him as my Lord and Savior, and I believe that I, as well as everyone else, will be accountable to him." In other words, he doesn't need to feel guilty anymore. He will be held accountable to God. Which, in pretty much every Christian denomination I'm familiar with, means that he gets to go and enjoy eternal paradise, but his heavenly mansion will be a bit smaller than others because of his sins in this life. If Christianity is true, he got to live out the last years of his life guilt-free and is now enjoying eternal bliss, while several of his victims are no doubt being eternally tortured for the crime of having died without accepting Jesus as their Lord and Savior. Some of them were kids. One of his 14-year-old victims was on the run from an abusive stepfather. Does a kid trying to get out of a dangerous home situation deserve eternal torture for being desperate enough to accept $50 in exchange for some nude pictures? Does Dahmer deserve eternal paradise because he apologized to Jesus for sending that kid to eternal torture? Christianity has this weird double-edged sword where it weaponizes guilt against good people for harmless things like masturbating, but then absolves the guilt of horrible people with nothing more than an apology to Jesus. The more heinous the crime, the more emphasis there is on freedom from guilt, with the harmless stuff being exaggerated in order to keep people feeling like they need to go to church, and more importantly tithe, in order to not be guilty anymore. This is why churches have such a problem with sexual predators in their ranks. Their system could not be better designed to entice immoral people into positions of authority. Then, they get to abuse their authority to do their immoral things, and when they get caught, they appeal to the forgiving nature of the religion. We're all fallen humans in need of God's grace. I am ultimately answerable to God, so no need to involve the secular authorities or anything. That would only damage the church's reputation. Of course, the apologetic answer to Dahmer's confession that he felt guilt before he was a Christian is simply that this is because, no matter how hard the atheist denies God, God's moral laws cannot be ignored. The problem here is that this just undercuts the very reason that atheists are said to be denying God rather than actually not believing in God. Not only does such an attitude leave the atheists looking like petulant children who know that they'll face consequences for their actions but think that pretending that they won't face those consequences will somehow let them live guilt-free, but since they feel guilty anyway, what is even the purpose of pretending that the consequences don't exist? Do Christians think that atheists are no better than the 4-year-old who boldly proclaims that he owns the house now, so he doesn't have to go on timeout? If that's how you truly see atheists, then I hate to break this to you, but you're actually the one who is in denial. You deny that the atheist is being truthful when they tell you what happens in their own inner life because you want to hold on to the idea that the Bible is the Word of God, and the Word of God says that atheists are petulant 4-year-olds. So that must be the case, no matter what they say. Now, this is not me just engaging in tu quoque. This is Christians obviously being in denial because they literally have to deny what countless atheists have already told them about their own inner lives in order to hold on to their beliefs. And while you can say that countless Christians have told atheists that they are just suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, it is a fact that an atheist is a better authority on what goes on inside their own head than a letter that was written to a specific congregation in Rome that was facing specific issues, with that portion of the letter basically explaining the hedonistic behaviors common in Rome and entreating the Roman Christians to avoid those same behaviors. Actually read through the first couple of chapters of the book of Romans sometime. Ignore the headings and chapter divisions, those were not in the original text. It was just one long letter. Without those divisions there, it is clear that the message Paul was sending was geared towards the Roman Christians who were preaching against the hedonistic behaviors of Rome while still engaging in them themselves. The "so that they are without excuse" line in Romans 1:20 actually looks like it's being directed at Christians who are engaging in the dishonorable passions and the lusts of their hearts and whatnot, given that chapter 2 starts with, "Therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things." And then it continues on a tirade against hypocritical Christians. He even goes on to say that when the Gentiles do what the law requires, even though they do not have the law, this shows that the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day when God judges the secrets of men. He's not talking about Christian Gentiles here, he's talking about everyone who is not born Jewish, and saying that their consciences can give them an excuse on Judgment Day. But, of course, apologists don't generally like contexts. They like to take verses as individual and complete thoughts, even though the authors of the various books of the Bible were not generally writing that way, with a few exceptions like the book of Proverbs. Paul did not separate the chapters of his letter to the Romans. He didn't put in the headings in various places to separate the chapters into subcategories. He just wrote one letter, and when you read it through without stopping where your daily devotional says to stop, it looks like Romans 1 was an admonition against Christians who were behaving unrighteously. I could very well be wrong here, but even if I am, it is abundantly clear that Romans 1:18-23 is not a passage that is meant to be taken in isolation, and does not mean what apologists say it means when they do isolate it. So anyway, Huxley. Remember Huxley? Dickie quotes a lengthy segment of a chapter from Huxley's Ends and Means, where Huxley states that the philosophy of meaninglessness was how he and his contemporaries justified indulging in sexual freedom. Of course, this quote is found in the middle of a chapter where Huxley explains why he considers such a philosophy to be wrong, saying things like, "It was the manifestly poisonous nature of the fruits that forced me to reconsider the philosophical tree on which they had grown," and "a philosophy of meaninglessness is accepted only at the suggestion of the passions, and is persisted in only by those whose heredity and upbringing make it possible for them to live as though the world were at least partially meaningful." Worth mentioning here is that Dickie introduces Huxley as a famous atheist. Huxley was not an atheist. He was an agnostic and was quite spiritual. This whole chapter is filled with him arguing for a deeper meaning to the world, and he uses things like art and music and the transcendent seeming experiences that they can bring on, as well as religious experiences, as evidence for this deeper meaning. He was inducted into the Vedanta Society of Southern California, an organization formed to study, practice, and spread the Hindu philosophical tradition of Vedanta. The dude was not an atheist, and was using his admission about why he engaged in the philosophy of meaninglessness for basically the same purpose that Dickie is here, to cast aspersion on anyone who doesn't believe in a deeper meaning to the universe. But hey, Dickie gave Huxley a long quote, so I'll do a longish one too. Examples of reversion to barbarism through mere ignorance are unhappily abundant in the history of Christianity. The early Christians made the enormous mistake of burdening themselves with the Old Testament, which contains, along with much fine poetry and sound morality, the history of the cruelties and treacheries of a Bronze Age people fighting for a place in the sun under the protection of its anthropomorphic tribal deity. Christian theologians did their best to civilize and moralize this tribal deity, but inspired in every line dictated by God himself, the Old Testament was always there to refute them. Ancient ignorance has been sanctified as revelation. That seems relevant to this chapter. We now move on to Christopher Hitchens and his book God is Not Great, with Dickie saying, throughout this book, Hitchens repeatedly attacked the Christian view of morality and decency. It is clear that Hitchens wanted to liberate mankind from the standards and laws of God's holy word that prohibits sexual impurity. While I haven't read it in a long time, and certainly Hitchens did advocate for sexual liberation from Christian puritanicalism, I don't recall that book really having a whole lot to do with sex. It was mostly about the heinous and immoral acts carried out by believers, with explanations about how they used their religion to justify those acts, with the underlying message that a belief in God is always detrimental. Whether you agree with that conclusion or not is irrelevant here, so I'm not going to get into it. My point is mainly that Dickie is representing that book as though it is a long-winded screed complaining that Christians should let people have more sex and nothing else. He finishes his chapter by listing a bunch of Bible verses that give what he calls universal principles and laws, most of which seem superficially to be good to the modern reader. Things like Micah 6:8, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God?" Ephesians 5:2, "Walk in love as Christ also loved us." And Ephesians 4:32, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another just as God in Christ also forgave you. And sure, if we ignore the bits about having to walk with God as being a moral principle, it's all fine and good, I guess. But this book has been an exercise in hatred towards atheists. Where is the love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you? Well, I mean, he listed that one too, but he doesn't seem to practice that one. Or any of these, for that matter. He seems rather to delight in the idea of atheists getting what's coming to them. The final moral principles he gives are just the 10 Commandments, the first 3 of which are to not have any other gods before Yahweh, don't make graven images, and don't take God's name in vain. None of those are inherently moral commands. It essentially just amounts to Dickie saying, be the same religion as me. Commandment 4 is to keep the Sabbath day holy. So we're 4 for 4 on commandments that not only are not inherently moral, but basically add up to suck God's dick. 5 is to honor your mother and father. But this one is hardly a universal. I don't think even Dickie would want it to be applied universally. I doubt very much that he would agree that a Muslim child should honor their father and mother by remaining Muslim. 6 is thou shalt not kill. We needed to get through half of the commandments before we get to one that is actually a good moral principle. Though, notably, Christians of Pastor Dickie's persuasion are often pro-death penalty, pro-military, pro-police being able to use lethal force indiscriminately, pro-gun, and so on. Of course, they get around this by pointing out that the word translated as kill here usually carries a connotation of murder rather than just killing, so it should be thou shalt not murder. And when the government, the military, the police, and people defending themselves kill, that's lawful killing, not murder, so it's okay. But then those same people will turn around and refer to abortion as baby murdering, even when it is lawful, so some consistency would be nice here. Anyway, 6 is a potentially good commandment, but lacks nuance, so it's subject to manipulation by motivated reasoning. 7 is to not commit adultery. With the modern definition of adultery, sure, I can agree that this one is good. But the biblical definition of adultery is essentially exclusive to a woman cheating on her husband. The men are apparently free to sleep around, and we can see this play out in the story of the woman caught in adultery in John. They say that she was caught in the act of adultery, and yet they only brought the woman before Jesus. The man she was with apparently got off scot-free. 8 is thou shalt not steal, which is generally a rule I can agree with, but I'm not going to turn someone in if I see them stealing food or baby supplies. 9 is thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. But interestingly, Dickie abbreviated it to thou shalt not lie, which is in itself a lie. The commandment was about giving testimony in a legal setting regarding your neighbor. Essentially, don't lie when you're on the witness stand. To misrepresent it as an admonition against lying when it is not is, amusingly, perfectly fine given the actual 9th commandment, but is strictly forbidden given the version that Dickie is presenting. Bit of a catch-22 if you ask me. If I lie about it and say it's a commandment not to lie, I'll be breaking my own commandment. But if I don't, then there's not really an explicit condemnation of the act of lying in the Bible. Well, okay, I mean there is in a lot of places, but it'd be missing from the Big Ten, and they're already in desperate need of bolstering. And the 10th and final commandment is to not covet. Don't want things. Which, again, is very interesting coming from Dickie. From my own personal experience with the man, which, if you aren't familiar, he was essentially the official pastor of the multi-level marketing thing that I was in, but from that experience, I know that he is very much pro-capitalism. The fundamental driving force of capitalism is covetousness. I want more, so I will work more to make more money to buy more things. Even in the ridiculously naive rose-colored glasses view where capitalism is based entirely on empathy, the market punishes bad actors, and the most successful entrepreneurs are the ones with enough empathy to recognize and meet the needs of their customers. Capitalism is still based on wanting more here. The entrepreneur who meets their customers' needs does so because they want more money to buy more stuff. The one who fails to meet their customers' needs ends up with a failed business, which is considered to be a failure for its lack of ability to provide money for the owner to buy the stuff that they want. We have a whole-ass economic system that stands in violation of the 10th commandment, an economic system that Dickie vigorously defends. And yet, he also calls the 10th commandment a universal principle or law. He ends by asking the question, what universal principles and laws can atheism give us? And yeah, he's actually got us here, because atheism is simply saying no as an answer to the question, do you believe in God? It doesn't actually provide any principles. It can certainly be something that informs your principles. I don't believe in forgiveness by proxy, so when I've done something to hurt someone, I would consider making amends with that person directly to be the right thing to do. Now, secular humanism is a moral framework that is informed by empathy rather than divine command. I don't want to say informed by atheism here because there are highly religious people who are also secular humanists, but they've come up with several principles that beat the snot out of the Ten Commandments, and they do so without even endorsing slavery like the Ten Commandments does. Things like securing justice and fairness in society, eliminating discrimination and intolerance, promoting altruism, integrity, honesty, responsibility, etc. So that's it for today. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Sean Meyer, who says about Matt Powell saying the sun burns different than fire on Earth because the air in space is different than the air here. May I just say, when Matt Powell said air in space, I suppose he was referring to the hydrogen gas that is found in space, followed by him explaining that hydrogen is everywhere in space. I can see why you might think that's what he said from the clip that I played, and I don't need much of an excuse to play the montage, so let's just hear it.
But in space, wouldn't it be a different scenario based on the fact that, the space and the air in the space is much different than the air we have here? That out of his mouth go burning lamps and sparks of fire leap out. The dinosaurs they discovered have, the dragons they've discovered have chambers in the back of their head. It's where they can breathe fire. But that's just a couple things. I mean,
if it's about survival of the fittest and we evolved from African Americans into other Americans, what about the African Americans that are still alive today?
well, I don't see anything wrong with quote mining. I believe if we study history, the Confederates were able to shoot pterodactyls.
T-Rex, they had short, stubby arms. And apparently now the chicken's able to do a handstand with those arms. Think about this. We have more in common genetically in certain areas with a gorilla than with an ape. Yet they say genetically we evolved from apes. We can tell based on genetics.
Honestly, John, I don't know a ton of technical terms. I'm very simple when it comes to science. I just enjoy simple science.
So, yeah. Out of context, you don't know that he's talking about why the sun can burn, but in context, that was actually him explaining that we can't know how the sun burns because fire would work differently in space because the air is different. Sean, I know you're a young Earth creationist who's embarrassed by Matt Powell's stupidity, so I'll give you this tip. If you're looking at anything that Matt Powell has put out, not only is he always wrong, but he is always wrong in a way that is even more wrong than you thought it was possible to even be. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Thrash, AGI Builder, and all the rest, who are the videos that I introduce as probably being short before proceeding to make the longest video in the series that is my channel. If you'd like me to constantly guess wrong about things that are hypothetically completely under my control, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today, we're looking at Pastor Dickie's book again. We're on chapter 6 now, and at risk of jinxing myself once again, I am predicting that this one is actually going to be a short one. Well, short for me anyway. Because this chapter is largely material we've covered thoroughly in previous chapters, so I shouldn't really need to go into too much detail, and I guess old Bobby Boy felt the same way because it's a fairly short chapter. Also, there's no bingo squares in this one, so we are taking a break from the bingo thing for today, but we only have 2 squares left for full square bingo, and I'm fairly certain we're going to get at least one of them in chapter 8. And hey, we've still got 4 chapters to get through, so it's impossible to keep up the pace at this point. Anyway, brevity is the name of the game today, so let's just hop right to it. As always, there's a card in the corner for you if you want to watch this entire series in a playlist. Let's go! Alright, so this chapter is called The Atheist Worldview Cannot Provide Answers for the Meaning and Purpose of Life. And if you think that sounds like a rephrasing of several of the questions from chapter 4, that's because it is. It starts out with what Dickie calls the 5 most important questions that any man can ask about life. 1. Where did man come from? Evolution and abiogenesis. 2. Who are we? Are we made in the image of God and therefore have eternal value? Or are we just a piece of mud that evolved out of nothingness? That's a really dishonest way to ask that question. Not only is that a straw man of the atheist position, it's also a false dichotomy to boot. It assumes that being made in the image of God is the only thing that could even possibly give our lives value, and that eternal value is the only kind of value worth having. First, I'd like to point out that value is a function of limitations. If you have an unlimited number of moments in your existence, then the value of any one moment essentially drops down to 0. After all, why do I need to spend time appreciating the moment that I'm in if I'm going to have an unlimited number of moments in the future? I can just recreate this one later anytime I want. And if we go to eternal paradise after we die, then honestly, we haven't missed out on anything if we don't appreciate any of our moments in this life, because the future moments in the next life will be way better. This life loses all of its value if we have an eternity of the next life to look forward to. Also, the whole just a piece of mud that evolved out of nothingness is not even close to an honest representation of evolution. Honestly, describing humanity as an evolved piece of mud is way closer to the creationist position than to the evolutionary one. God literally made man out of mud in your story. For abiogenesis, though, the oversimplified version of one of the major hypotheses is that the cycle of rain and evaporation caused a concentration of certain chemicals, such as iron cyanide compounds, which, through combination of UV light exposure, autocatalytic reactions, and reactions catalyzed by phosphate, developed into RNA nucleotides, which became encased by lipid membranes to form the first protocells. Once you have self-replication, evolutionary forces will act on the replicating molecules, and competition for resources with other replicants drives the trend toward increasing complexity. 3. Why are we here on this planet? Because this is where we evolved. If we evolved on a different planet, we'd be on that one, asking why we were on that one. It's really that simple. 4. How should we live our lives? This is the question of morality. Well, seeing as how we live in a society and are a social species, we should probably try to maximize well-being and minimize harm in our lives, as that will generally guide you towards doing things that will benefit both yourself and society at large. Cooperation is the name of the game. Question 5 is, where are we going? This is the question of destiny. Well, if we let religion run things, we end up at war, death, and disease. That's the way it's been since time immemorial. When a religion seizes control, it strives to stamp out any competition and spread itself as far as possible. Apostates and competing religions cannot be tolerated. Whenever a religion has political power, it has used that power to oppress, discriminate, and kill people of other religions and of no religion. To quote the authors of a 2004 paper published in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, after giving a long list of examples of religious violence, they say the examples of religion in conflict could be multiplied. To say that these are anomalous cases is to beg the question, are there exceptions? We suggest no. To be sure, few new or old religious groups create violent goals. However, tension and conflict are inherent in all religious groups and are central to their identity formation and group mobilization. Once again, violence is not often a religion's intent, but as an outcome of its relation to culture and politics, it is certainly not an uncommon consequence. Religion needs conflict, and when it doesn't arise naturally, it creates it. After these 5 questions,
3 questions, 3 questions.
Which he just assumes that his religion answers perfectly without explanation, he says, as a pastor, I have been called upon through the years to comfort and minister to people in the most harrowing of circumstances. I have often observed that if I did not have the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, what in the world could I say to these dear people in their times of suffering, loss, and trial? Here's the thing, though. Let's grant for argument's sake that there is no way to offer an atheist comfort at the loss of a loved one, or in a time of suffering. Let's grant the Christian position. God exists, and we come to salvation through Jesus Christ. Now, since you have the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, how do you bring comfort to the loved ones of a non-Christian who died? Hey, if you come to salvation, you'll never see them again, but then at least you won't be burning in hell with them. That doesn't exactly strike me as a message of hope and comfort. The more tactful preachers will get around this at funerals by obliquely mentioning God's love and desire for everyone to be saved without getting into the specifics of what the person who died actually believed. And there are plenty of less than tactful preachers out there who see funerals as opportunities for evangelism. And even the tactful Christians can find themselves saying things that wind up being unintentionally hurtful. They're in a better place is meant to provide comfort, but if we take their theology seriously, they're actually in the worst possible place imaginable. Their pain is over now. Well, according to your worldview, the real pain is only just beginning. Now sure, it might be comforting for Christian families of Christian dead people to hear those things, but in any other scenario, at best, they will be received neutrally, but realistically, they will hurt. And on top of all that, in times of loss, Christians act as though they don't believe their own story. If you really believe that your loved one has now moved on to eternal paradise and you get to go join them later, you'd be happy for them. If a good friend of mine gets their dream job and has to move away to where I likely won't see them again for several years, I might be a little sad at their departure, but my happiness at their transition to a better life would overwhelm that bit of sadness. But Christians at funerals for Christian loved ones are just as sad at the loss as an atheist at a funeral for an atheist loved one is. So the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ doesn't even manage to take the sting out of death, which is supposed to be the main thing that it accomplishes. At this point, he gives a lengthy quote from known sexual predator Ravi Zacharias, which, to be fair, the first allegations were made public 3 years after this book was written, so I'm not faulting Dickie for quoting a sexual predator. I merely bring this up to emphasize a point that I've made in previous videos. Christianity is structured in a way that makes it incredibly appealing for sexual predators to seek positions of authority. The church is worried about its reputation, so it will do its best to hide your misdeeds from the authorities if you get caught, including strong-arming victims into signing NDAs, transferring you to a new location where people don't know that you're a predator, paying for silence, etc. But also, the emphasis on forgiveness, with everyone being a fallen, fallible human being, means that it will be much easier for predators to seek forgiveness not from their victims, but from other parishioners, who see them confess their sins publicly and praise them for their bravery in making such a public admission, while the victims just get pushed aside, silenced, and sometimes even chastised for threatening to do harm to the church by going to the secular authorities. The Christian God is supposed to be the source of our morality, and yet not only is he unable to choose human representatives who will exemplify upstanding moral behavior, he seems rather to attract the perpetrators of some of the most immoral actions imaginable. Anyway, the Zacharias quote is a long one, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically, to summarize it, it's him telling a story of a time when he gave a talk, and a student interrupted the lecture by standing up and shouting, "Everything in life is meaningless!" Zacharias countered with, "Is that statement meaningful?" To which the student answered, "Yes," followed by Zacharias saying, "Well, if your assertion is meaningful, then everything in life is not meaningless, and if everything is actually meaningless, then that includes that statement, so you've effectively said nothing." It's Apologetic Word Games 101. Learn how to equivocate. Now, first and foremost, I doubt that this story ever even happened, and if something like it did happen, I doubt very much that it happened in the way described. Like, it was probably part of a Q&A session rather than a random interruption for starters. Second, in the statement, "everything in life is meaningless," the word meaning is referring to the important or worthwhile quality or purpose definition of meaning. But when Zacharias asks if the statement is meaningful, he is using the "what is meant by a word, text, concept, or action" definition. To switch between definitions like this while pretending like you're talking about the same thing is equivocation. And while it might be enough to win a word game with someone who doesn't notice that you're switching definitions on them, it isn't a good way to make a valid point. So if you believe that meaning implies an eternal significance, then I can believe that everything in life is meaningless in that sense, while still agreeing that the statement "everything in life is meaningless" is a meaningful statement in the sense that the words in the statement all have definitions, and when those words are strung together in that order, it is possible to understand the message that I intended to deliver when I said them. He then goes on to repeat the tired old claim of atheists having to borrow from Christianity in order to account for things like meaning, happiness, purpose, or the reason for life, which is absolutely untrue. In fact, I'd say it's rather the opposite. Well, for meaning and purpose and the reason for life, at least. Happiness is the result of chemical reactions in the brain. Christians don't have to borrow from atheism to understand that, nor do atheists have to borrow from Christianity to account for that, but meaning, purpose, and the reason for life is something that Christians can't really account for if their worldview is true. If Christianity is true, then our mortal life on this earth is, ultimately, meaningless. After all, if you're going to spend an eternity in paradise, what does a few decades of mortality matter? The very existence of eternity causes this life to lose its meaning, purpose, and reason. Without eternity, this life is the only life we have, so not only do we get to choose our own purpose, we also have every reason to make the most out of the one life that we do have. In order for a Christian to pretend that this life has any meaning to them, they have to do one of two things. One, either accept the depressing idea that every person has the same purpose and that purpose is purely to worship God, or two, borrow from the so-called atheistic worldview in order to make their life's purpose about something other than sucking God's dick, like working to improve the lives of their fellow human beings. If we all will truly live for an eternity, then improving the lives of our fellow humans is ultimately meaningless. Their eternal life is way more important than this life. And that's how we end up with people like Mother Teresa, who raise enormous sums of money ostensibly to help the poor and suffering, but glorifying their suffering rather than relieving it. They also did things like trying to convert people on their deathbeds, because after all, what does the suffering in this life matter if you get an eternity of paradise afterwards? It's the eternal life that's important, not this life, so focus on converting people so that they can get the better eternal life that we can't actually demonstrate exists, and don't worry about the fact that they are miserable in this life. At this point, Dickie moves on to quoting Sartre from one of his passages where he talks about being condemned to be free. Now, as will surprise no one, I have not read the extensive works of Sartre, but I have read the transcript of the talk that this quote is from, and I can say quite conclusively that Dickie completely missed the point. To summarize, Sartre explained that we are condemned to be free in the sense that we do not create ourselves, and yet we exist in a state of moral freedom, where we are responsible for our own choices and actions. So in that sense, we did not choose to be free, and we cannot choose not to be free, for even such a choice would be a freely made choice, and even our choice of which authority to relinquish our freedom to would be a reflection of our freedom. He gives an example that I'm rather fond of that shows how moral ambiguity demonstrates the lack of clear instructions from any sort of moral authority like God, the example being a man whose brother is killed in World War II. This man is now the sole supporter of his mother, but he has a choice to make. Should he enlist in the French resistance to the Nazis in order to not only get personal vengeance for the loss of his brother, but also to assist in the defense of his community? Or should he remain with his mother? Scripture gives no clear answer to this. Christian doctrine says to act with charity, love your neighbor, deny yourself for others, etc. How is one to interpret this doctrine in this situation? Love your neighbor and deny yourself could be to deny your desire to care for your mother in order to fight for the defense of your community, but it could also be to deny your desire to fight for the community in order to care for your mother. Who is to say which is the morally correct route to take? Christianity does not give us an answer. The man must choose for himself. Even if someone should seek advice, you generally know what kind of advice you're going to get from the person that you go to before they give it. So who you go to in order to seek advice is a reflection of the choice that you alone are making. There is no universal moral arbiter who can answer this question. It is up to the man himself. But of course, Dickie didn't give enough context to actually get all of that out of Sartre's quote. He's not even getting the quote from the transcript of the lecture itself. He's getting it secondhand from a lecture given by Shandon Guthrie. And amusingly, the link he provides for the lecture is dead, with the top-level address leading to a page that my browser doesn't want me to go to because it's malicious. But Dickie says that the implications of what Sartre is saying are terrifying. If indeed we have nothing behind us or before us to guide, instruct, and to declare values and behavior, can you not see why this would lead those who are consistent with this twisted worldview to nihilism? As if nihilism is inherently bad. Dude doesn't seem to have heard of optimistic nihilism. But that's beside the point. Sartre was, as the very quote that Dickie copied said, an existentialist, not a nihilist. So one wonders why Dickie insists that agreeing with an existentialist viewpoint on morality would lead one to nihilism instead of existentialism. Dickie is presenting this as though there are only two options: morality from divine command, where things are right and wrong purely because God said so, and nihilism. This is not true. There are a plethora of options for where morality comes from, as you can learn if you actually read the transcript of Sartre's lecture for yourself, rather than relying on hand-me-down out-of-context quotations. Besides, this still leaves us with the question of why God's commands should be viewed as moral to begin with. What of his commands that we morally disagree with, such as the multiple times he commanded genocide? Are we to just blindly accept that genocide was good in those instances because God commanded it? Or do we do what so many apologists do at this point and transition to consequentialist morality, making excuses that justify the genocides based on the supposed bad behavior of the cultures that God commanded to be wiped out?
We need to understand this was not an arbitrary ethnic cleansing, but in fact, this is a specific judgment on a morally degraded people.
God's command for Israel to drive out the Canaanites was not race-based, but behavior-based, as the Canaanites engaged in acts that would be considered criminal in civilized societies.
First, it starts off with incest, and then it goes into adultery, then it goes into offering your children to Molech, homosexual sins, and then bestiality. And we know from Canaanite primary source documents that all of these things were being practiced by the Canaanites.
He gives reasons, right? He doesn't just wake up like a mob boss and go, Canaanites, I want them dead, right? He's got reasons for it. And probably the biggest reason, after 400 years of warning, is that the Canaanites were sacrificing their children on the molten hot god Molech, this idol.
If we do the latter, then we are admitting that morality does not come from God. If we do the former, then we have to come to grips with the fact that God often commands things that go against our moral intuitions, which are supposed to have been placed there by God. So, God commands us to go against the moral intuitions that he gave us? Dickie ends this chapter by quoting a few Bible verses, saying that they indicate that the Christian worldview gives loving instruction from the God who made us, with the relevant Bible verses being Genesis 1:28, then God blessed them and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Matthew 6:33, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. And finally, 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. So that confirms it. The meaning of life, according to the Bible, as filtered through Pastor Dickie, is to suck God's dick. Also, have babies and subdue the whole earth. That mindset definitely hasn't caused us any problems like climate change. No, sir. So the main purpose in our lives, aside from making babies, is to tell God how great he is. Why do you think that that is such a great purpose? What is special about that purpose? Why should I want that to be my purpose? And why does God need to hear how great he is from me? Is he that insecure that he needs his imperfect creations to constantly reassure him that he is great? Christians paint this picture of God as being perfect, all-powerful, and all-knowing. If God actually is how Christians say he is, then our glorification of him means nothing. It literally cannot accomplish anything at all. And by contrast, if we live our lives in a refusal to glorify him, as Pastor Dickie believes that atheists do, then that cannot possibly do any harm to him whatsoever. Which makes this whole live life on earth as a test to see if you believe in Jesus thing completely meaningless. Our meaning is to worship a guy who cannot possibly give a shit whether or not we worship him, and if we fail to do so, he will punish us despite him not possibly caring about our worship. And Christians try to spin this as a good thing. Of course our worship should mean nothing to such a being. That's why God is so amazing. He has no reason to care about whether we heap piles of flattery upon him, but he chooses to eternally torment the people who don't do that anyway. Isn't that great? No. No, it is not. And that's the end of the chapter. I actually managed to keep it fairly short. How about that? Today's comment of the day comes to us from everyone who was pointing out that the estimated number of 100 million deaths attributed to communism is likely a massive overestimate. I am aware of that fact, and I probably should have gone into more detail about it, so I'll do that here. The number of deaths attributable directly to communism is extremely difficult to calculate. Take famine, for instance. The 100 million number includes everyone who died during all the famines in every communist country during the 20th century. This, very obviously, cannot be 100% attributed to the style of government. If there's not enough rain, there's not enough rain, regardless of whether it's a capitalist or communist country. However, some of those deaths definitely are attributable to communism. They saw Mendelian genetics as a Western capitalistic science and used state-mandated Lysenkoism as their basis for understanding biology, which informed their policy regarding agriculture. And Lysenkoism was pseudoscientific. It did not work. So how many famine deaths were the result of the famine, and how many were the result of the famine being exacerbated by Lysenkoism? It's impossible to parse out completely. But that's not the only problem with that number. It also includes things like the Nazi soldiers that were killed during the invasion of Russia in World War II. Are we to be sympathetic to the Nazis in our effort to make communism look bad? And it goes on. There are many more problems with that number, and I absolutely should have mentioned that I was using the highest estimate for deaths caused by communism that was available in order to avoid the appearance of cherry picking, but I failed to do so. Sorry. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the freedom that was not chosen by my channel. If you'd like to condemn me to be free, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today, I'm going to try and bang through the final 2 chapters and the conclusion of Pastor Dickie's The Problems with Atheism book. I feel like this is an attainable goal here. As much repetition happens throughout this book as Dickie seemingly struggles to hit a word count, these final 2 chapters are almost word-for-word reiterations of ideas that he went over sometimes more than once in previous chapters. Side note, I wanted to see if there was a minimum page count required by his self-publishing website, and googled "The Problems with Atheism Dickie," and in so doing, I learned that one of my videos is the first search result for that, with his actual book being second, and most of the rest of the first page results being episodes of my podcast from this series. So, that's fun. Sadly, this is the end of our bingo game. He never quite gets to saying that Darwin is an atheist authority, and he never uses an argument that could be interpreted as a no atheist in foxholes argument, instead seeming to favor an atheism leads you to the worst of the foxholes type of argument in the chapter that I thought for sure was going to check that box. So we're 2 boxes shy of a full square bingo, but we do have 4 vertical, 3 horizontal, and 1 diagonal bingo, which I still find very impressive given that these bingo squares all came from Twitter suggestions from users who knew nothing about this book other than its title. Anyway, enough preamble, on to Chapter 7! Chapter 7 is titled, "The Atheist Worldview, by its sick very nature, leads to despair, meaninglessness, and nihilism." This whole chapter is basically a direct copy and paste from any previous chapters where Dickie quoted Sartre, Nietzsche, or Huxley. He begins by explaining that atheism leads to existentialism, and existentialism leads to nihilism, ignoring the fact that existentialism largely grew out of an opposition to nihilism. Atheism leads to existentialism, existentialism leads to nihilism. Nihilism
leads to suffering.
To oversimplify, nihilism began its rise in the late 19th century and was essentially the idea that everything is meaningless. Existentialism was a philosophical movement that was incredibly broad, and as such can't really be adequately boiled down to a simple phrase, but part of its emergence in the mid-20th century was an acceptance of the fact that there is no transcendent meaning to life or the universe, so it attempted to find meaning through the self-creation of meaning. There are no unifying principles of existentialism. You can find religious existentialists and secular ones. Existentialists who embrace the idea of radical freedom, like Sartre, and those who rejected it. In some ways, Martin Luther King Jr. was an existentialist. I don't think Dickie would argue that he was in any way a nihilist. He tries to tie existentialism to a worldview that would lead to nationalistic wars, though not using quite that language. He's got more than a bit of a nationalistic streak himself, so he wants you to think of the Holocaust or the communist dictatorships rather than just the general concept of nationalism. But the way he words it, rather ironically, made me think of the consequences of overblown jingoism and nationalism, which I think is far more readily tied to the atrocities of the 20th century than atheism is. He says, "What if a person, a group of people, a community, or a nation find that the existential purpose that they have decided to build their lives and world around is not so pleasant to their neighbors? This has happened all too frequently in history." And yes, I agree with that, though without tying it to existentialism. Religion can and has been used to that end with far greater frequency than existentialism. I'm not going to go into that here. I gave a list of incidents where religion was the motivating factor for horrible abuse in my response to Chapter 5, and actually looking back on it, I focus specifically on Christianity because Dickie is incredibly dismissive of other religions, but the list could be extended quite a bit if I included non-Christian religions as well. He then quotes 1 Corinthians 15, and goes on for longer than an apologist is supposed to for this verse. This is the passage where Paul says in verse 17 that if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile, you are still in your sins. And that's usually the end of it. But Dickie goes all the way to verse 22. In verse 19, Paul writes, "If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men the most pitiable." That is basically a refutation of Pascal's wager. The whole point of Pascal's wager is that you don't lose anything if you spend your life as a believer, but it turns out that you were wrong. Well, Paul is saying here that if you spend your life as a believer and you are wrong, then you are to be the most pitiable of all men. Kinda irrelevant here, but still interesting to me. After another Sartre quote that is undoubtedly removed from context that would completely change its meaning or impact, we get a repeat of him talking about how he wouldn't be able to comfort people who have lost loved ones if he were an atheist. But this time, he gets extra gross about it, saying, "If I was an evolutionary existentialist, I could say, don't feel badly here, your little baby had no meaning for its existence in life anyway. It was just a piece of slime that crawled out of the primordial swamp, and it is no big loss in the grand scheme of things. Your baby was born to go nowhere, and it has gotten there a little quicker than the rest of us." As cruel and cold as those words sound, they would be valid if I held to the atheist worldview. Here's the thing about that, though. Even if those words were valid, that doesn't mean that it's impossible to be tactful when talking to someone about their deceased loved one. Your inability to think of anything that could bring comfort to someone who's grieving without bringing up Jesus does not mean that it's impossible. For instance, my favorite excerpt from what the officiant said at Mrs. Rhino's funeral is, "Everything she has done is still done. Everything she has loved is still loved. Everything we have learned from her is still learned." Sure, there might not be eternal significance in the sense that when the universe meets its end, then even the most impactful human in existence will have made no difference in how or when the universe meets its end, and any difference that they made within the universe will be completely wiped out at that point. But, and I know this is going to be difficult for you to understand, but when that happens, I will not be around anymore. The people I know and love will not be around anymore. I will no longer be in a position to care about whether or not I had an impact. The thing that matters most to me is having an impact on the lives of the people that I care about in the here and now. I do not crave eternal significance. I crave personal significance. At this point, he makes the statement, if it's possible to charge one thinker more than anyone else with the Holocaust of the 20th century, then we would have to point to Nietzsche. Which I find to be completely ludicrous. Seems like if we were laying the blame for the Holocaust on one single person, that person would be Adolf Hitler. Now, sure, you could argue that his use of the word thinker there would limit the potential blame candidates to philosophers, but as Hitler saw himself as a philosopher and great thinker, I think his inclusion is valid here. He then quotes Nietzsche, saying that he predicted that the outcome of his own philosophy would be wars such as have never been waged on Earth. Well, fun fact, but if we look at war deaths per 100,000 people, World War II just barely squeaks ahead of the 30 Years' War of the 1600s, and it's been on a mostly downward trend ever since, with it now being at almost the lowest point in human history. Weird trend to be happening if atheism is on the rise, and also atheism is to blame for the massive devastating conflicts the likes of which have never been seen on the Earth. And that's basically it for Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is called "The Greatest Problem with Atheism is that it cannot prepare men for death." The existence of Dave Warnock and his nonprofit organization I Am Dying Out Loud kind of proves this whole chapter wrong pretty conclusively. For those of you who don't know, Dave Warnock is a former fundamentalist evangelical. He became an atheist in 2011 and in 2019 was diagnosed with ALS, which on average has a life expectancy of 3 to 5 years after diagnosis. He has spent his time since that diagnosis advocating against the unwanted intrusion of religion in the areas of healthcare, dying, and death. If you listen to Dave speak, he is prepared for death, and he vehemently objects to religious leaders taking advantage of people in vulnerable situations in order to push their religion on them. At one point in this chapter, Dickie asks the question, how does an atheist comfort a husband when his wife has passed away? And since I have direct personal experience with this one, I'll tell you, by offering sincere and heartfelt condolences combined with doing actual real things to help. I don't have a lot of friends locally, but my friends, and a number of my fans that are spread out across the world, did things like send me gift cards for meal delivery services and Amazon. They encouraged people to donate to her favorite charity in her memory. People made guest videos for my channel so that I could take time off work without worrying about losing income. And so much more. Do you know how the Christians comforted me? Well, firstly, the Christians that I know personally were wonderful and did some of the same things that I've already mentioned here, though there were a few unintentionally hurtful remarks that I overheard at the funeral. But I had Christians send me messages and comments on my channel informing me that she is now burning in hell and that I'd join her there if I didn't repent. He says atheism is an arrogant, obnoxious, and insulting worldview. But in my time of grief, not a single atheist was arrogant, obnoxious, or insulting toward me, and while most Christians were not, and the ones that I knew personally were not being that way intentionally, it's still a point of fact that the only people who were obnoxious or insulting about the death of my wife were the Christians who Dickie is saying are the only ones who wouldn't be that way about a death. At this point, he goes into a who was Jesus spiel that apparently he normally has in pamphlet form, and it's all the typical apologetics BS that we're used to. Millions don't know who Jesus was, and millions more have incorrect views about him. He lived a sinless life and died for our sins and was raised, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. Next up is the conclusion, which he begins by reiterating the chapter titles, which kind of serves to reinforce the point that was made to me by a commenter in the introduction section, that he doesn't actually expect people to read the text of his book, so he writes the chapter titles not with the intention of piquing your interest, but with the intention of leaving you feeling like you have read the whole book, even if you've only actually read the table of contents. Interestingly, the main takeaway from the conclusion is that Dickie seems to be a bit of a Calvinist, saying things like, unless the Lord opens their hearts to the truth and draws them to Christ, they will perish, and the unbeliever cannot change his attitude about God any more than man can change his skin color. In the end, the Lord of the universe must change the heart of the atheist and give him the ability to believe on Christ and his gospel. This leaves one wondering why Dickie even bothered to write this book. Whether or not someone is an atheist is in God's hands, so if there is a rise in atheism in recent years, that's because God wants there to be a rise in atheism in recent years. This also leaves me questioning Dickie's sense of justice. If the only way an atheist can be brought to Christ is through the action of God bringing them to Christ, is it really just for God to punish those who die without him having brought them to Christ for the crime of not having been brought to Christ by God? He goes on to say, we can love people and show them the love of Christ through our own actions, but in the end, God must change the hearts of those who do not believe. Which, aside from continuing to confirm the predetermined nature of salvation, is also a load of bullshit. Nothing in this book could be interpreted as Pastor Dickie showing atheists the love of Christ. Though, to be fair, this book is clearly not aimed at atheists. It's meant entirely to spread fear of atheism among Christians. Because if you're scared of atheism, you're less likely to consider it as a possibility should you start having doubts about Christianity. And that's it! We're done with Pastor Dickie! It's been fun, but I can't say that I'm sorry to see him go. Now the question is whether or not to donate the book, complete with my hand-scrawled margin notes, to a Christian bookstore for fun. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Simon D, who says, came for the bingo, stayed for the puddles. Well, guess I'd better finish off with the puddles now since I left y'all permanently edging bingo-wise. Her hair's growing back at least. Slowly but surely. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream Osiris every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Tamo Schwartz, John Saunders, and all the rest, who are the repetition that helps me hit the word count that is my video. If you'd like to make it obvious that I have nothing of substance to say, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Jeez, girl, you come in here whipping your thing around, making all sorts of noise. This is an outtake now because I am recording, so me whipping your thing around.
Oh my god.
Go whip around somewhere quietly. Recording with kids home is a pain in the butt. Recording with kids home is a pain in the butt. Don't hit your dad. Go away, go away.
But I'm being a literal pain in the butt.
Oh, hey, you coming to visit? You coming to visit? Yeah, do people like the puppy in the outtakes? So since I'm recording and this is all going to be an outtake anyway, we can get to see puppy. Hello, puppy. Yeah, you got to go upstairs, kiddo. I need everybody to be shush. You're smelly. Have you been out for a walk in the rain? You smelly dog. Now my sweater's smelling. I need to wash my sweater. It's okay. Yeah, you're a cute little puppy. You people loved you last time. The people loved you. They demanded more. More puddles. More puddles in the outtakes. Yo. Sleepy girl. Sleepy girl. You take a nap. What do you think? Can I record with you taking a nap on my shoulder like this? Oh my gosh, she's going to sleep. She's actually going to sleep. It's adorable. Oh. I don't think she'll be able to sleep if I'm talking at my normal volume. Oh. After losing my belief, I just stopped without finishing the sentence. What the fuck was I going to say there? Okay. Okay, Puddles, I think you should go upstairs and take a nap with the people that are being quiet for me. Oh, she's going to sleep. She's a sleepy puppy. Oh, you sleepy puppy. Oh. Okay, you go upstairs. You don't want to go upstairs? You want to stay with me? Go take a nap upstairs, come on. Please don't rest your paw right on the microphone. Ah! Your public is waiting. You know. There you go. You good puppy. If we opened up our heads and found that our brains were incredibly simple, clearly incapable of carrying out the complex Oh, he's going to sleep. Oh, my little sweetie. You can take over my channel. Is that your plan? Is that your plan? Take over my channel? I can make my microphone sound so good. Can you just sit down? Just sit down. Just sit your butt down. Sit your little paws down. Oh, hello. Hello. Hello, hello, hello. Yeah, you're a good puppy. You're a good puppy. Sit down. There you go. There you go. Done making background noise, puppy? Okay, off you go. Wish the camera was on her. It was a cute little prince. And that was all recorded. That's not going in the video. If atheists actually had a greater proclivity, the word is proclivity. Proclivity. Not an amateur clivity, a proclivity. Really don't believe? Fuck off. You're on Do Not Disturb. Why are you disturbing? Killing two beloved Dartmouth professors. Killing two beloved Dartmouth.
Thank you for my new monitor.
You're welcome.
Now pat my bum. I said pat my bum. Okay, good night.
This is going in the outtakes, just so you know.